Story 1. It was the happiest day of Naomi's life until the moment she uncovered the one truth that would destroy everything she knew about love, family, and fate. A DNA test meant to confirm her joy revealed something unfathomable. The man she was about to marry was the very person who had ruined her childhood. The man she thought was the love of her life was the monster who had torn apart her family. This is the story of an impossible betrayal, and the woman who had to face it head-on. What would you do if you uncovered a secret this devastating on your wedding day? Naomi's early years were painted with the warmth of a perfect suburban life, the smell of freshly cut grass on a summer's day, the sound of the ice cream truck rumbling down the street, its jingle echoing in the air, drawing children from every corner of the block. Her childhood seemed unshakable, wrapped in a comforting cocoon of family and familiarity. But nothing lasts forever. Jason was her world, her younger brother, the one person she could count on. Through every scraped knee, every broken toy, every late-night whispered secret between two siblings who knew each other's hearts better than anyone else, they were inseparable. Naomi, the ever-watchful older sister, and Jason, the playful spirit who could never sit still. Together they spent hours playing in the backyard, pretending to be superheroes, building forts and running through the sprinklers with wild abandon, their laughter filling the house like a sweet melody. But one day Jason was gone. It was like a switch had been flipped. One moment, Naomi was running alongside him in their yard, their voices bouncing off the walls of the house. The next, Jason had vanished without a trace. His disappearance wasn't a sudden storm crashing down in a flash. It was a quiet, creeping terror. He was just gone. Naomi's mother, frantic, combed the streets, knocked on doors, filed every missing person's report she could, her hands trembling as she held each form. But every lead turned into a dead end. The police investigated, but the clock seemed to tick faster than they could catch up. Jason had simply slipped through the cracks, leaving nothing but unanswered questions. Naomi watched her mother grow weary, a shell of the woman she had once known. Her mother's once bright eyes clouded over with worry and exhaustion. She tried to keep hope alive, but Naomi could see it slowly fading piece by piece. Her mother would sit in silence, staring at a photo of Jason, asking no one in particular, where did he go? What happened? But Naomi couldn't answer that question. For Naomi, the grief was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was the kind of pain that didn't have a name, a wound that couldn't be stitched closed, because it wasn't just the loss of a brother. It was the loss of a part of herself, the world she had known no longer existed. She searched for him everywhere, through old records, through files from the foster system. Her heart raced with every phone call, every report, every moment that could have been the breakthrough she so desperately wanted. But nothing. The search was endless. Every night, her dreams would turn into dark corridors, paths that led her to nowhere. Her brother, her childhood, everything she had once known, seemed to slip further away as she sank deeper into her own obsession with finding him. Each year that passed without a trace of Jason felt like a lifetime. Naomi's life began to revolve around one question, one burning truth she couldn't escape. Where is he? She found herself alone in rooms filled with old photos of a life that once felt whole, flipping through the pages of yellowed newspapers, looking for any sign that would lead her to him. The house felt emptier with each passing year. The quiet was suffocating. Her mother grew more distant. And Naomi, well, she became a stranger to herself. She couldn't accept what was happening, couldn't accept that her little brother, the person she loved most in this world, might never come back. And so the search continued. Not just for Jason, but for Naomi's own peace of mind. She became consumed, obsessed. As the years went by, her friends drifted, her relationships strained under the weight of her pain. Naomi's life was no longer about moving forward, it was about going backward. Uncovering a past that was lost. Finding a brother that time seemed determined to erase. The world outside moved on, but not Naomi. She was still searching. Then came Alex. He seemed to have stepped straight out of Naomi's dreams. A man whose smile could light up a room, and whose charm seemed endless. From the moment they met, Naomi couldn't deny the connection. It was like all the pieces of her fractured world fell back into place. Alex wasn't just a man, he was a balm to her wounded heart. Kind, attentive, and always there when she needed him. Alex quickly became the anchor Naomi had longed for. Their love was easy. Effortless, even. He was the kind of man who remembered her favorite flowers, her preferred brand of coffee, the way she liked her pillows fluffed just so. He made her feel seen in a way that no one had before. He soothed the parts of her soul that had been left raw by the disappearance of Jason. He was a protector, a lover, a confidant. Everything Naomi had ever wanted. They fell into a rhythm, one that felt almost too perfect to be true. Naomi found herself lost in the warmth of his embrace, his affection, his promise of forever. He proposed on a rainy autumn evening, the soft glow of candlelight reflecting in his eyes as he dropped to one knee. "I can't imagine my life without you," he had whispered, and Naomi, overcome with emotion, didn't hesitate. She said yes without a second thought. She had found the one. Or so she thought. As their wedding day approached, the excitement in Naomi's heart began to grow. Everything was set. The dress, the venue, the guest list. But somewhere, in the back of her mind, something lingered. A nagging feeling she couldn't shake. It wasn't that Alex had done anything wrong. He hadn't. He was perfect, in every sense of the word. But as the big day drew near, Naomi started to sense that there was something off. It wasn't something she could articulate, but it was there, lurking in the corners of her mind, growing louder as the days passed. It wasn't about Alex himself. It was more about the overwhelming feeling that her life was moving too fast, that something wasn't aligning as it should. She told herself it was just the nerves, the natural anxiety of wedding planning. Everyone experiences it, right? It was probably nothing more than the pressure of creating the perfect day, the fear of stepping into a new chapter of life. But still, every time Alex touched her, every time he smiled, every time he whispered sweet words of reassurance, Naomi couldn't fully push the feeling away. She couldn't deny the unease, though she tried with all her might. She convinced herself that it was just the weight of the moment. But there it was, as undeniable as the rhythm of her heart. Something was missing. Her friends noticed it too. There were moments when Naomi seemed distant, almost distracted. Her best friend Rachel had mentioned it once, a casual comment made over coffee. "You don't seem as excited as you should be," Rachel had said, looking at Naomi with a mix of concern and curiosity. Naomi had brushed it off with a laugh, insisting that she was just overthinking things. After all, this was the man she loved, the one she'd dreamed of for years. What could possibly go wrong? Still, that little voice in her head never stopped. The question, the discomfort, gnawed at her like a quiet, relentless whisper, one that only grew louder as the wedding drew closer. Naomi began to wonder if it was normal to feel like this. Was it common for brides to have doubts? Was she just too scared of the unknown? Or was there something more to it? But love, as Naomi had come to believe, was about trust. And with Alex, she had never felt safer, never felt more cared for. She pushed the feeling aside, telling herself to be patient, to stop overthinking. The wedding would happen, and everything would be fine. She had no reason to suspect otherwise. Yet, as she stood in front of the mirror, her wedding dress fitting perfectly, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her veil, Naomi couldn't escape the thought, what if I'm making a mistake? The question haunted her in quiet moments, in the silence of the night when the wedding planning had slowed down. It sat with her in the company of friends and family, who all praised her good fortune, as if she had won some prize. But Naomi could only smile in response, the flicker of doubt still present behind her eyes. On the eve of her wedding, Naomi sat quietly, her hands trembling slightly as she ran them across the smooth surface of the wedding invitation. The room was filled with the calm excitement of preparations, the hum of activity swirling around her. Friends and family were bustling in the background, final touches were being made, and everything seemed to be falling into place. It was supposed to be the happiest night of her life, and yet, a part of her felt uneasy, unsettled. That's when the package arrived. It wasn't a grand gift, nothing that stood out immediately. Just a small envelope neatly addressed to Naomi with Alex's handwriting on it. She raised an eyebrow, unsure of what to make of it. She had no idea that this small, seemingly inconsequential gift would unravel everything. Inside was a DNA test, a simple home kit, wrapped in a little bow. A note accompanied it. "I know we've talked about it before, but I thought we should be sure. I want everything to be perfect, Naomi. I love you." Naomi smiled, touched by the thoughtfulness. But still there was something about it that felt off. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the timing, the day before her wedding. But she pushed the thought away, telling herself it was just the pressure of everything that had built up over the past few weeks. It's just a test, she reasoned, no big deal. But even as she told herself that, her fingers hovered over the small box. She stared at the words, Ancestry and Family Match printed on the kit. And for the first time in months, a cold chill ran down her spine, though she couldn't quite explain why. Was this some sort of sign? She brushed it off as the nerves of the moment, and without a second thought, she followed the instructions. Easy enough, just a swab, send it off, and wait for the results. As the evening wore on, Naomi felt an odd tension settle over her. A quiet unease that she couldn't shake. She put the test away, told herself to focus on the wedding the next day. After all, this was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, the culmination of everything she had ever dreamed of. The love of her life was waiting for her, but something in her gut kept gnawing at her. She couldn't explain it, but she couldn't push it aside either. The morning of the wedding arrived, crisp and bright. Naomi awoke early, her nerves were a tangled mess. Yet the excitement for what was about to come pulled her through. She was going to marry the man she loved, the man who had healed her heart. Alex. Just as she finished her final preparations, her phone buzzed. The results had come in. The email subject read, "Your DNA results, family match." Naomi froze, the breath caught in her chest. There it was, the moment she had been waiting for, though she didn't know what she was really waiting for. She clicked the email, her hands shaking as she opened it. The familiar words seemed to blur as she read the results, but then as her eyes focused, the meaning hit her like a wrecking ball. She reread the line, her brain not processing the words at first, then again and again, hoping that it was some kind of mistake. But it wasn't. The test results linked her to Alex in a she could never have anticipated. Alex was not only her fiancé, he was her lost brother. The truth, the devastating truth, slammed into Naomi with a force that left her breathless. Her knees buckled, and for a moment the world spun. Her pulse raced, the room began to blur. She gripped the edges of the table to steady herself, but nothing could steady her heart as it pounded against her chest. A whirlwind of thoughts flooded her mind. This can't be right. There's no way. How is this even possible? She stared at the screen, the results staring back at her like an accusation. Alex, the man she had planned to marry, the one she had thought would be her forever, was her brother. Her mind raced. How had this happened? For a moment, Naomi couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The wedding she had been preparing for months, suddenly seemed like a cruel joke. Her dreams of walking down the aisle towards Alex, of becoming his wife, shattered in an instant. The reality of what the results meant, of the truth she could no longer deny, crushed her under its weight. Her first instinct was to call him, to demand answers, but she couldn't. The thought of hearing his voice, knowing what she now knew, paralyzed her. She stared at the phone, her hand hovering over it, but no words came. What could she say? How could she even ask the questions that had no answers? Naomi's chest tightened as the room seemed to close in around her. Her emotions were a chaotic jumble, fear, disbelief, dread. She wanted to run, to escape, to forget it all, but she knew she couldn't. This was the truth, and it was suffocating her. How could she marry him? How could she share a life with him, after discovering that he was the very person who had been the source of her childhood trauma? The silence of the room was deafening, the world outside continuing on, unaware of the storm swirling inside Naomi. Her wedding day, the day she was supposed to feel pure joy, had turned into a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. The reality set in slowly, painfully, each second more excruciating than the last. She felt as if she were drowning, gasping for air, as the truth pulled her deeper into the abyss. There would be no walking down the aisle today, no vows, no promises, nothing. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the weight of the truth, but it was there, impossible to ignore. The question burned in her mind, and there was only one thing left to do, confront him. But what would she say? What could she say? As Naomi sat frozen in that room, the weight of the truth pressing down on her, the world outside seemed to blur, muffled by the chaos inside her own mind. Her thoughts were a whirlwind, scattered pieces of memories that no longer made sense, now twisted into something she could never have prepared for. The gift of a DNA test, meant to bring clarity, had instead torn apart everything she knew about herself, her family, and the man she thought she loved. Alex, the person she had chosen to spend her life with, was no stranger. He was not the sweet, perfect fiancé she had imagined. He was the boy from her past, the boy who had once been her brother. But that was just the beginning. The truth was much darker. As Naomi tried to steady her breath, the memories that had once been buried deep inside her began to resurface, pushed forward by the force of the revelation. She felt them surge back into her consciousness, relentless, pulling her into a past she had worked so hard to forget. Every moment, every touch, every memory she had shared with Alex came crashing back, but now they were stained with the horrifying truth. She remembered the days of her childhood, before the pain, when Alex had been her whole world. He had been her protector, her playmate, the one person who had never left her side. They had shared the same room, the same laughter, the same love, so much love. He was her best friend, her constant companion, the one who had always been there. Naomi could still hear their laughter echoing through the halls, the sound of two siblings with an unbreakable bond. But those memories, once filled with warmth and joy, now twisted into something unrecognizable. As she sat in the silence of the room, the echoes of those innocent days now haunted her. There were moments Naomi had tried to push away, to bury beneath years of pain and confusion. The flashes of discomfort that had always lingered in her mind, though she never fully understood them at the time, little things. The way Alex would sometimes stare at her too long, his gaze too intense. The fleeting touch of his hand when it should have been innocent, but something about it made her skin crawl. She had brushed it off then, telling herself she was being paranoid. After all, he was family. He loved her. He was her brother. But now the memories came rushing back like a flood, and Naomi could no longer deny what had been happening in the shadows of her childhood. Alex hadn't just been her brother. He had been something else entirely. Something she had failed to recognize as a child. Something that had shattered her innocence. Something she had repressed. Too painful to confront. Naomi's chest tightened as she thought back to the day she had run from him. The day she had first understood the depth of the betrayal. She was too young to understand everything at the time. Too naive to grasp the reality of what was happening. But the pain, the fear, the confusion, it had all been real. And now, sitting in this room, on the edge of her wedding day, Naomi finally understood. Alex had not only been the person who had hurt her most deeply, but he had also been the one she had chosen to love, to trust, and to marry. The man who had stolen her innocence, who had violated the very trust they shared as siblings, was the one she had planned to share her future with. The man who had shattered her world before was now standing at the center of it again. But this time it was worse. This time there was no denying it. There was no escape. Her mind reeled as she tried to process the horrific truth. How had she not seen it? How had she not known? The years of searching for her brother, the years of longing for answers, had led her back to him, but in the most devastating way imaginable. Naomi's thoughts twisted, turning back to the countless moments she had spent with Alex, thinking they were building a life together. Every word he had said, every promise he had made, now felt like a lie. The love she had for him, was it real, or was it a facade built on deception? She had loved him, trusted him, shared her deepest dreams with him. How could she have been so blind? She thought of their time together in the present, the way Alex had swept her off her feet, the way he made her feel safe, cherished. The laughter they shared, the warmth of his touch, the way he held her close and whispered sweet words. But now, in the face of the truth, it all felt like a cruel illusion. The man who had been her protector had also been her abuser. The man who had promised her forever had stolen something far more precious than she could ever comprehend. Naomi's heart felt like it was breaking in two as the weight of the truth crushed her. Her life had been turned upside down, her future uncertain. She had been preparing to marry the man who had once been her brother, the man who had caused her so much pain. The realization was overwhelming, suffocating. How could she ever go forward after this? How could she even face him? She stared at her wedding dress, the symbol of her future, but it no longer felt like a symbol of love and joy. Instead, it felt like a shackle, a reminder of everything she had lost. The life she had dreamed of was now shattered, and the man she had chosen to build that life with was the very person who had stolen her past. Naomi's thoughts were a tangled mess of disbelief, anger, and grief. She didn't know what to do, what to think. She wanted to scream, to run, to erase this entire day from her memory. But there was no running from the truth, no erasing what she had discovered. The damage had been done. Alex had been a part of her pain for far longer than she had realized, and now, he was at the center of her nightmare. The truth was inescapable, and Naomi could do nothing but sit in the wreckage of her shattered reality, her heart heavy with the weight of the past, the present, and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The confrontation had been building in Naomi's mind for days. There was no escaping it, no more running from the truth. The world had shifted beneath her feet, and now she had to face the person who had caused the unthinkable pain in her life, the man she once called her brother, the man she had trusted with her heart, the man she had planned to marry, Alex. Naomi had spent hours, sleepless nights, pacing back and forth, trying to figure out what she would say when she finally confronted him. What words could capture the depth of the betrayal that now lay in front of her, undeniable and raw? How could she make him understand the depths of the devastation he had caused? Could she even expect him to feel any remorse? to truly understand the destruction his actions had wrought. She walked to the place where he was sitting, his back turned to her, unaware of the storm that was about to break. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, and her throat tightened with every step. She wanted to scream, to run away, to pretend like none of it was happening, but she couldn't. This was the truth, and the truth demanded to be faced, no matter how much it tore her apart. Alex, his name felt foreign now. How could she still say it with love, with any trace of affection? The man who had once been her closest confidant, the one she had shared everything with, was now the cause of her greatest torment. And yet she had to say his name, because facing him was the only thing left she could do. Alex! His name came out of her mouth like a whisper, strained, broken. She saw him stiffen, just a slight movement. His shoulders tensed, but he didn't turn around. He didn't acknowledge her voice. Instead, he continued fiddling with his phone, as though nothing in the world could be more important than the triviality of his next message. Naomi's hands trembled, her breath shallow as she fought the urge to crumble. Why wasn't he looking at me? She had wanted this moment to feel like a reckoning, a demand for justice. But instead, it felt like she was invisible, like her pain was nothing more than a nuisance. Alex, she said again, louder this time, trying to command his attention. But he only sighed, glancing up at her from the corner of his eye, still unwilling to give her his full attention. He couldn't be bothered. He couldn't care less. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. The anger bubbled up inside her, searing through the shock and disbelief. How could you, she finally demanded, her voice breaking through the silence. How could you do this to me? To us? He put his phone down with a casual gesture, leaning back in the chair, his expression still unreadable. His face, that face she had once adored, now felt distant and cold, like a mask she had never seen before. He looked at her, but there was no trace of regret, no flicker of guilt in his eyes. You're making this into something bigger than it is, he said, his tone flat, dismissive. You always do this, Naomi. Overthink. Overreact. Naomi's blood ran cold. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words were stuck. She had wanted this moment to be the turning point, to see the truth reflected in his eyes, to see him admit what he had done. But instead, she was faced with indifference. His words, overreacting, making it bigger than it is, sounded like a cheap excuse, like a feeble attempt to brush away the weight of his crimes. Bigger than it is, Naomi repeated, her voice shaking with both disbelief and fury. This is what you've reduced it to? After everything? This is how you see it? Like it's nothing? Like I am nothing? Alex's eyes flickered with the slightest hint of impatience, but that was it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He wasn't even apologetic. He simply sat there, unbothered, and scathed by the bombshell Naomi had just dropped on him. I don't know why you're so worked up, Alex said, rubbing his temples as though he were dealing with an inconvenience. You've always been dramatic about these things. You know I care about you. I always have. A cold chill ran down Naomi's spine. Care? He cared. She could barely stand to hear the words, let alone believe them. How could he sit there and say such things without flinching, without even recognizing the depth of the devastation? How could he not see how everything he had done, everything he was, had ripped her apart from the inside out? Naomi's anger burned hotter, but beneath it, something else began to settle deep in her gut. Disgust. How could she have ever believed in him, in the love he had promised her? How had she let him into her life, into her heart, knowing what she knew now? The silence between them stretched on, thick and suffocating. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest, pushing the words back down her throat, until finally, she couldn't contain it anymore. Do you even realize what you've done? She whispered, her voice breaking, the tears she had fought so hard to hold back finally spilling down her cheeks. You've destroyed everything. Everything I thought was real. Everything I thought I knew. How could you do this? How could you destroy me like this? Alex stood up then, casually, as if the conversation had gone on long enough. He didn't say a word. His indifference felt like a slap in the face. Naomi watched him walk toward the door, his back to her, and she felt the final fracture of her heart. Don't you dare walk away from me, she spat, her voice a desperate, broken command. You can't just walk away from this. You can't just leave me here with nothing. But Alex didn't even look back. He reached for the door, and without so much as a glance, stepped out into the hallway, leaving Naomi standing in the midst of her shattered world, gasping for air. She was left alone with the truth, and with the devastating realization that Alex, the man she had loved, was someone she could never fully understand. Someone who had never truly loved her back. The confrontation was over, But Naomi felt as if she had lost everything in that one moment. Everything. As Naomi tried to piece together the remnants of her shattered life, she turned to the one thing that had always promised a form of resolution: justice. But she quickly learned that justice, when weighed against the indifference of the law, was nothing more than an illusion. She reported everything. Everything. The truth of her past. Of Alex. The DNA test. The painful memories. Naomi sat with detectives, explaining in painstaking detail the horrors she had faced, the trauma she had buried for so many years. She poured out everything. Her heartache. Her confusion. Her anger. She needed answers. She needed someone to hear her. To believe her. But as the weeks turned into months, Naomi realized that the system wasn't built for someone like her. It wasn't built for people whose trauma was so buried that it was nearly invisible to the outside world. Her own story, her own pain, was treated as just another set of circumstances. Too complicated, too tangled for anyone to understand. Where were the charges? Naomi asked herself again and again. Where was the justice she deserved? It wasn't that they didn't listen to her. They did. But in the end, Alex was untouchable. Naomi found out, almost by accident, that Alex had been legally adopted as a child. His past, the part of him she never truly knew, had been sealed away. Locked behind legal walls that she couldn't breach. No birth records. No family connections. His identity, the one that should have been shared with her, was hidden behind the guise of adoption and legal obfuscation. The very system she had turned to for help had, in a sense, erased the man who had caused her such pain. The police. The investigators. They couldn't do anything. There were no criminal records to dig through. No undeniable history that they could link him to his past. Naomi was devastated. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. How could this be happening? How could the man who had destroyed everything for her walk away without facing any consequences? How could she, after everything, be left with nothing but a painful truth and the overwhelming weight of her own silence? The lack of charges weighed heavily on her. Heavily on her spirit. She had hoped for something, anything, that could hold Alex accountable. She had hoped that the law would recognize the crime he had committed, even if it had been buried deep for so many years. But there was no accountability. No justice. Just silence. She tried to fight, but the emotional and psychological toll was unbearable. Naomi had hoped for resolution, for closure, but instead, she was left with a system that refused to acknowledge the reality of her suffering. The system turned its back on her, and the feeling of helplessness washed over her like a tide she could not escape. And so, Naomi was left questioning everything about herself. How could she have trusted him? How could she have loved him? How could the man she had married, or thought she would marry, be the same person who had stolen so much from her? The questions piled up, each one more paralyzing than the last. Who was she really, if the man who had torn apart her past was the one she had trusted with her future? She had believed in him. She had loved him. But now she realized she had been blind to the truth, to the man he had truly been all along. The weight of her emotional breakdown was all-consuming. Naomi had lost herself in a system that offered no answers, no justice, no sense of closure. And in the end, all she was left with was the truth of what Alex had done, and a system that didn't care. Each day, Naomi tried to rebuild herself, but it was hard. The emotional scars were deep, and the legal failure made it worse. She sought therapy, joined support groups, talked to others who had been victims of unimaginable trauma. But even in those spaces, Naomi was forced to confront the harsh reality. Justice, real justice, was not going to come for her. It wasn't going to come for the hurt she had endured. It wasn't going to undo the damage Alex had caused. And so Naomi found herself, day after day, piecing together her life from fragments, trying to rebuild her identity, while the man who had caused it all walked free unpunished. She felt betrayed, not just by Alex, but by the very system that was supposed to protect her. A system that had failed to recognize her pain, her history, and the person who had caused it. Her hope for closure slipped further away with each passing day, each failed attempt to seek justice. The truth was too much for Naomi to carry alone, and with no justice to lean on, she found herself walking through the world, broken but determined to survive. She had lost a piece of herself, but she wasn't about to lose what remained of her future. Even if the world didn't understand her, even if the law couldn't protect her, Naomi knew one thing. She was going to find a way to move forward. She had no choice but to. In the wake of the devastation, Naomi retreated from the world she had once known. The loss, the betrayal. It felt like she was walking through a fog, each step uncertain, each breath heavy with the weight of the truth she had just uncovered. The man she had loved, the man she had trusted, Alex, was a ghost of a past she couldn't outrun. She had to face it, but first, she needed to find herself again. It wasn't easy. Healing, Naomi quickly learned, doesn't happen overnight. There's no instant fix, no simple answer. It's a slow, painful unraveling, like pulling apart the pieces of a life that has been shattered beyond recognition. Naomi felt the sharp sting of isolation, but also a quiet urge to start again, to rebuild. For the first time in years, Naomi allowed herself the grace to step back and just be. It wasn't a choice so much as a necessity. She couldn't keep pretending. So she took a breath, and then another, and made the decision to start the healing process. But it wasn't a straight line. It was jagged, unpredictable. Each day was a new battle between the weight of the past and the possibility of a future that felt distant and foreign. The first step was therapy. She had always been reluctant to seek help. She had convinced herself that she could handle everything alone. But the truth was undeniable. She needed help. She needed to talk, to untangle the knot of pain and confusion that had become her life. And so she sat down with someone who didn't know her, who didn't have preconceived notions about who she was or who she had been. Naomi began to open up, bit by bit, exposing the rawest parts of her past. At first, it felt impossible. To talk about the horrors she had faced, the love that had turned into betrayal, the trust that had been shattered. It was too much. The words stuck in her throat, suffocating her. But with time, Naomi found the courage to speak. The therapy sessions became her safe space, a place where she could put down the weight of her story without judgment, without fear of being misunderstood. It was a small victory each time she let go of the silence. But therapy was just one piece of the puzzle. Naomi needed to reclaim her identity, the one Alex had stolen from her. She needed to remember who she was before him. It was a process of reflection, of asking herself hard questions. Who was I before the pain? What did I want before my world crumbled? It was a quiet, private conversation she had with herself, one that no one else could understand. And in those quiet moments, she began to rediscover herself. She thought of the Naomi she used to be. The girl who laughed freely, who dreamed without limits, who believed in love with all her heart. She had lost her somewhere along the way, but she was still there. She was still inside. Naomi made the conscious decision to find that girl again, to reclaim the joy and the hope she had once held so tightly. It wouldn't be easy, and there were days when the grief and the loss threatened to swallow her whole. But Naomi knew this. She had to try. It wasn't just therapy. Naomi surrounded herself with people who understood her pain. Women who had been through similar betrayals, who had felt the sting of trust broken. Together, they formed a quiet bond, one built on shared experiences, empathy, and understanding. In these spaces, Naomi began to find strength in numbers. She wasn't alone. There were others who had been through the fire and come out the other side. They offered their stories, their wisdom, and in return, Naomi shared her own. Slowly, she began to realize that healing wasn't just about facing her past. It was about finding solidarity, finding strength in the broken pieces. Each day was a small victory. The pain didn't go away. It couldn't. But Naomi learned how to live with it. It became a part of her story, yes, but it no longer defined her. She began to take long walks in the park, feeling the fresh air against her skin, remembering the simplicity of just being alive. There were still moments when the weight of the betrayal threatened to crush her, but in those moments, Naomi learned to pause, to breathe, and to let the world keep moving, even if she couldn't keep up with it. There were days when Naomi would stand in front of a mirror and look at herself with new eyes. She wasn't the woman she had been before the truth came crashing into her life, but she wasn't the same woman who had faced it either. She had been forged in the fire, shaped by the wounds, but stronger than she had ever realized. Naomi started to see herself not as a victim, but as a survivor. A woman who had been torn apart and pieced back together with more strength than she had ever known. She wasn't the woman who had loved Alex. No, she was someone different now. Someone who had learned to love herself again. It wasn't easy. It was messy. But Naomi took each step with purpose, with determination. Each day she chose to fight for her peace, her future, her identity. The road ahead was still uncertain, still filled with obstacles Naomi couldn't yet see. But she knew this. She was no longer defined by the past, by the betrayal, by the pain. She was more than that. And that realization, that quiet understanding, was the beginning of her true healing. It wouldn't happen overnight. But with each passing day, Naomi walked further into the light, her heart a little lighter, her spirit a little stronger. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to hope again. In the aftermath of the chaos, Naomi was left standing in the ruins of everything she once believed. The journey she had embarked on, the fight to reclaim herself, had been long and filled with more pain than she ever imagined. But in the end, it was a journey that would lead her to the only place she could ever truly find peace. Herself. Naomi's life, as she once knew it, had been irrevocably shattered. The person she had loved, the person she had trusted, Alex, had betrayed her in ways she could never have prepared for. But over time, Naomi learned that the truth, no matter how painful, was the only way forward. She couldn't live in the shadow of a lie any longer. She had spent so many years suppressing the truth, convincing herself that the love she felt for Alex was real, that their future together was possible. But that was before she knew what he had done, before she knew who he really was. As much as Naomi wished things could have turned out differently, as much as she wanted to go back to the days when Alex was just the man she thought she loved, she couldn't. She could never undo the truth. And in that truth, painful, heartbreaking, and impossible to reconcile, Naomi found her freedom. Not because she forgave him, not because she could ever forget what had happened, but because she could finally let go of the man she had once known. The man who had been both her brother and her betrayer, and make room for the person she had always been meant to become. But that freedom didn't come without its own set of questions. Could Naomi ever forgive Alex? Could anyone who had endured such a betrayal find a path to redemption for the one who caused the pain, and for herself? The questions lingered in the air long after the truth had been revealed, unanswered and haunting. What was the cost of forgiveness? Did it mean Naomi had to accept everything Alex had done to somehow make peace with the past? Could she find a way to move forward while still carrying the weight of what had been stolen from her? She often found herself asking these questions, unsure if there was ever a clear answer. There was no clean slate for Naomi, no way to undo the years of pain, the shattered dreams. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by someone she would never be able to unsee. And yet, as time passed, Naomi began to understand that her path forward didn't lie in forgiveness, at least, not in the way she had once thought. It wasn't about absolving Alex or excusing his actions. It was about freeing herself from the chains of a past that had weighed her down. She didn't need to forgive him to move on. She only needed to let go. For Naomi, healing was a process of self-rediscovery. It wasn't a destination, it was a journey. She no longer needed the answers to every question, because she had learned that not all things could be understood. Not all wounds could be healed. Not all wrongs could be righted. But that didn't mean she had to remain stuck in the ashes of what had happened. It meant she had to keep moving forward, step by painful step, until she was whole again. She had faced the darkness of her past, and it had shaped her, but it no longer defined her. She realized that her identity was never truly tied to Alex or to her past. It was tied to her ability to choose who she would be in the future. There were no easy answers. The scars, the pain, the haunting questions, they would always be a part of her story. But they didn't have to be the end of it. Naomi's new beginning was one built on the strength she had found through her pain. The lessons she had learned through the hardest moments of her life. She wasn't the same woman she had been before. And that wasn't a tragedy. It was her greatest triumph. As Naomi stood at the threshold of her future, she knew that she had been forever changed. The journey ahead wouldn't be simple. There would be more challenges, more moments of doubt. But there was also a sense of peace she had never known before. She had learned that her worth wasn't defined by the love of a man or by the wounds he left. Her worth was her own, and no one could take that from her. The world wasn't going to wait for Naomi, but she was ready to rebuild, ready to reclaim the life that had been hers all along. And with that, Naomi closed the chapter on Alex, on the past. The future was her own now, filled with possibility. The only question left was this. Story 2. It started like many stories do, with love, or at least something that looked like it. A man, successful, respected, but lonely, finally finds the woman he believes was made just for him. She was everything he thought he needed, young, beautiful, full of life, and he was ready to give her everything he had. His heart, his name, his future. His mother warned him. She told him to wait, to be careful. She saw something he didn't, or maybe something he just refused to see. But he wouldn't listen. He couldn't. Love has a way of making us blind to the things we don't want to believe. 2 months after their wedding, he was gone. Just like that. One moment, he's heading out for what should have been a simple trip. A quiet weekend away, something he'd done many times before. But this time, something was different. He didn't come back. Hours passed, then days. And when they finally found him, he wasn't the same man who had left. He was barely alive, broken in ways no one could understand. And by his side, the woman who had promised to love him forever, watching, waiting, with a calmness no one could explain. At first, no one asked too many questions. Accidents happen, they said. Maybe he fell. Maybe someone was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But the deeper you looked, the more it felt wrong. Too many things didn't add up. Too many questions with no answers. And one person who should have been shattered seemed almost untouched. What really happened that weekend? Why did he leave? And who stood to gain if he never came back? Today, we take you into a world where trust becomes a weapon and love becomes something else entirely. This was only the beginning. George Allen was the kind of man who didn't need to say much to be understood. At 40 years old, he had built a life that many respected. A self-made entrepreneur from the heart of Atlanta, he ran his own small construction company, one he started from nothing. People who worked with George would tell you the same thing. He was honest, dependable, and didn't cut corners. He wasn't flashy, didn't care for the spotlight, but if you needed him, he was there. Always. His life wasn't filled with grand gestures or loud moments. George believed in the quiet things, early mornings with coffee on the porch, the steady hum of work that kept him busy, and the stillness of the woods where he found peace. He was the kind of man who fixed what was broken, who paid his bills on time, who called his mother every Sunday without fail. But behind all that, there was something missing. Something even George couldn't put into words. For all his success, for all the respect he earned, he lived alone. He had spent years focused on building his life, on doing what was right in love. That was something he had put off. Not because he didn't want it, but because it never seemed to fit into the plans he had made. He dated, sure. There were a few women over the years, but nothing that lasted. His friends would ask, "When are you going to settle down, George?" His answer was always the same: when the time was right. And then, one summer evening, the time seemed to come all at once. That's when he met Christina. She wasn't like anyone George had known before. At 25, Christina Brooks was young, vibrant, and had a way of lighting up every room she stepped into. She had style, she had charm, and she had that kind of energy that pulled people in. George was drawn to her instantly. Maybe it was her smile. Maybe it was the way she looked at him like he was the only one who mattered. Whatever it was, it didn't take long for him to fall. They met at a charity event in June, one of those things George normally wouldn't attend, but a friend had convinced him. Christina was there with friends, dressed sharp, laughing loud, living life in a way that felt almost unreal to George. But when they talked, she made him feel seen, like he was special, like he could be more than just the man who worked hard and went home alone. For Christina, George was different too. He wasn't like the guys she knew. He was older, sure, but he had stability, a calmness that made her feel secure. And more than that, he had the means to give her the life she wanted. Within weeks, they were inseparable. Dinners, weekends away, gifts she'd never asked for but always accepted. George was happy, maybe for the first time in a long time. But not everyone saw it that way. Loretta Allen, George's mother, had a different feeling from the start. At 65, Loretta had seen enough of life to know when something didn't sit right. She had raised George on her own after his father passed when he was just 7 years old. She knew him better than anyone, knew his quiet ways, knew how he loved, knew how he trusted too easily when his heart got involved. When George brought Christina around, Loretta smiled, polite as always. But behind her eyes was doubt. It wasn't just Christina's age, though that was part of it. It was the way she looked at things, the way she talked about what she wanted, about what she deserved. Loretta saw the handbags, the designer shoes, the constant need for more. And she saw how George, blind with love, tried to give it all to her. She didn't stay quiet. One evening, as George sat at her kitchen table, Loretta leaned in, her voice low but steady. "She's too fast, Georgie. She's got eyes bigger than her means. Love don't pay no debts." George listened because he always did, but he didn't hear her. He believed Christina just needed time. Time to adjust. Time to see the value in a simple life. In love that didn't come with a price tag. He believed he could show her. He believed love was enough. But sometimes wanting something too much can blind you. And by the time the truth comes to light, the damage is already done. August 14th, 2021. The wedding was everything Christina had dreamed of, and more than George ever thought he'd want. The church was packed, every seat filled, and whispers of admiration followed Christina as she walked down the aisle. Her dress, custom-made, shimmered under the lights. And George stood at the altar, eyes fixed on her like she was the only thing in the room. To the guests, it looked like a perfect day, a union of love, a fresh start. The photographs showed smiles, laughter, and a couple ready to take on the world together. But beneath the surface, there was another truth. Loretta Allen watched from her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She smiled when she was supposed to, nodded when people offered congratulations, but inside, her heart was heavy. She knew her son. She knew he was in love. But she also knew he wasn't thinking clearly. Christina was everything Loretta feared. Too young, too fast, too demanding. But George wouldn't hear it. So Loretta did the only thing she could. She stood beside him, swallowed her doubts, and pretended. Pretended that she believed in this marriage. That she believed in Christina. But the unease never left her. The reception was grand. Christina had spared no expense. The food, the music, the decorations, all of it carefully chosen to impress. And it did. People talked about that wedding for weeks. About how beautiful it was. How lucky George was to have found someone like her. But none of them knew what life would look like after the party was over. By September, reality set in. Christina moved into George's home, like she owned it. The decorations changed. The simple, comfortable space George had built for himself became something else entirely. Flashier, louder, filled with things he didn't recognize. She filled the closets with new clothes, shoes lined up in rows, handbags displayed like trophies. George tried to adjust. He told himself it was normal, that she just needed time to settle in. But it wasn't just the things she brought in. It was what she refused to do. One morning over breakfast, George mentioned that he had talked to a friend about a job for her. Something easy, just a few hours a day. Christina didn't even pause. She looked at him, her voice sharp. "Why would I work? I'm your wife now. I deserve to be taken care of." And just like that, the subject was closed. The spending didn't stop. If anything, it increased. Every week, packages arrived. Trips were planned. Christina lived like they had more than enough. Like money would never run out. George tried to keep up. He worked longer days, took contracts he didn't want, pushed himself to cover the growing expenses. He didn't tell anyone, not even his mother, how bad it was getting. The savings he had built over years began to disappear. The bills piled up, and with every purchase, every demand, George felt himself slipping further behind. His business, once solid, started to crack. He missed deadlines, struggled to pay his workers. Clients noticed. Jobs he used to finish with pride became burdens he couldn't carry. But he kept going. For Christina. For the life he thought they were building. He believed somehow things would balance out. Then came the call. His sister, 3 states away, was sick. Cancer. The kind that doesn't wait, doesn't care about timing. She needed treatment, long and hard, and couldn't care for Simon, her son. George didn't hesitate. Simon was family. 16. Too young to be on his own. Too old to be bounced around. George promised to take him in. To look after him like his own. Simon moved in just before the end of September. A tall, quiet boy. Polite. Respectful. He didn't ask for much. George set him up in the guest room, made sure he was enrolled in school, gave him space. It felt good having him there. For George, it was a chance to do something right. To help someone who needed him. He didn't see the tension it brought into the house. Christina wasn't thrilled. She said all the right things at first. Welcomed Simon. Smiled. Made him feel at home. But there was something in the way she looked at him. Something George missed. It wasn't just kindness. It wasn't just family. At first, it seemed harmless. Christina treated Simon like any aunt would treat a nephew. Warm smiles. Casual jokes. Little moments that made him feel welcome. George appreciated it. He thought she was trying, making an effort to build a family. To connect with the boy who had just left his sick mother behind. In George's eyes, Christina was being kind. Supportive. But there's a between kindness and attention. The kind that lingers too long. That crosses lines without warning. Simon had only been living with them for a couple of weeks when Christina started noticing the little things. How he kept to himself. How he was quiet around strangers, but laughed when he felt comfortable. She'd compliment him on it, saying things like, "You've got that strong, silent thing going on, just like your uncle used to." Or, "You're growing up fast, Simon. Bet the girls at school can't keep their eyes off you." At first, Simon just smiled, unsure of how to respond. But she didn't stop there. Christina started making excuses to be around him. When George was at work, she'd call Simon into the living room. Come watch this movie with me. It's boring watching alone, she'd say, patting the spot next to her on the couch. He'd sit, awkward at first, trying to keep his distance. But Christina? She'd laugh loud, nudge him during the funny parts, let her hand rest on his arm longer than necessary. She began to notice when he'd come out of the shower, teasing him lightly. You're going to be taller than George soon, she joked one evening, eyeing him in his towel. Simon blushed, hurried past, but the moment stuck. There were days when George was gone early and came back late. Christina made sure Simon had breakfast, made sure he was fed. But sometimes, she'd sit across from him at the table, eyes fixed, talking about things he didn't know how to answer. You know, it's nice having you here, she'd say softly. It's been lonely. George is always working. You're good company. Simon didn't know what to make of it. No one had talked to him like that before, especially not someone like her. It got worse. She started showing up in his room, saying she was just checking in, sitting on the edge of his bed, asking about his day. Sometimes she'd brush something off his shoulder or fix his collar, her fingers lingering just a little too long. One afternoon while George was out, Christina came into his room with a bag. I bought you something, she said, pulling out a brand new hoodie. You've been wearing the same old thing. I thought you'd like this. Simon thanked her, confused but polite. He didn't want to seem ungrateful. At times, she'd knock on his door, saying she couldn't sleep, asking if he wanted to talk. She'd sit close, her voice low, telling him how hard things had been for her, how no one understood her. George is always gone, she whispered one night. You're the only one who really listens. Simon didn't know what to do. He was 16, caught between right and wrong, between loyalty and confusion. He didn't tell George. He didn't tell anyone. How could he? Christina was beautiful, older, and he didn't want to cause trouble. But every day the tension grew. Every word, every touch, pulling him deeper into something he couldn't control. Then came the night everything changed. It was late. George had gone on an overnight trip for work. Christina knocked on Simon's door, saying she couldn't sleep. She sat on the edge of his bed, wrapped in one of George's shirts, her hair loose, her voice soft. What happened next didn't feel real to Simon. It felt like a dream, like something he couldn't stop even if he wanted to. That night, they crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. After that, there was no going back. They found moments, whenever they could, when George was at work, when the house was quiet. Christina told him it was their secret, that no one would understand, that what they had was special. Simon believed her. He believed her when she said she cared about him. He believed her when she said they could have a life together, without George. He believed every lie, because she made him feel wanted, needed. But secrets like that don't stay hidden forever, and love, when twisted, can turn into something dangerous, something deadly. By November, something in the house shifted. It was no longer just about the debt, or the tension, or the lies that had built up between George and Christina. It was about power, control, and what someone would do when they felt they had run out of options. Christina, once the charming young wife, now walked through the house with a purpose that no one could quite place. George, tired and distracted, didn't notice the way she spoke to Simon had changed. How her words, once playful, now carried a weight he wasn't ready to handle. One night, after George had gone to bed, Christina sat with Simon in the dim light of the living room. The TV flickered, but neither of them was really watching. She leaned in, her voice low, steady, almost too calm. You know, Simon, she said, sometimes people stand in the way of what we're meant to have. Simon looked at her, unsure. What do you mean? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to him, her eyes fixed. He's worth more dead than alive. Simon froze. He laughed, nervously, like she had to be joking. But Christina didn't laugh. She just stared, waiting for him to understand. You see how hard it is here, she continued. How he's struggling. We're struggling, and you. You could have anything, we could have anything, but not with him in the way. Simon shook his head. He's family. He took me in. Christina didn't let up. She leaned closer. And what has he really done for you? You think he's going to give you a life? He barely has one himself. Look around, Simon. We're drowning. But with that insurance money, things would change. Simon didn't answer. He stood up, walked away, trying to clear his head. But the words followed him. They didn't go away. She didn't stop. Days passed. Christina would find moments, small ones, just to remind him. A touch on the shoulder. A whispered promise. You don't have to live like this. We could be free. You know I care about you, right? It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about control. About bending someone until they broke. Simon hesitated. He avoided her, stayed out late, tried to act like nothing had changed. But Christina? She pushed harder. Every chance she got, she reminded him of what could be. George was still blind to it all, still working, still hoping to pull them out of the mess. He didn't see how far things had gone. He didn't see how close danger really was. December 12th, 2021. The morning started like any other, quiet and still, with just enough chill in the air to remind George that winter was close. He liked mornings like this. It reminded him of why he loved the woods, why he loved getting away, even if only for a couple of days. He moved around the house carefully, not wanting to wake anyone, but Christina was already up. She stood in the kitchen, dressed in one of his old sweatshirts, her eyes on her phone, her face unreadable. "I'll be back Sunday," George said, adjusting the strap on his rifle case. She didn't look up right away, just nodded, then finally said, "Be safe." No kiss, no goodbye hug, just 2 words. Safe. He took that with him as he walked out the door, locking it behind him like he always did. Simon was gone. George hadn't seen him since the night before. Said he was going to see his sister, spend the weekend with family, and George didn't question it. He trusted Simon, raised him like a son. There was no reason not to believe him. By noon, George had made it to the woods. Pine Ridge was quiet, almost untouched. He liked it that way. He set up camp near a small clearing he'd used for years. The fire pit was still there from last season. The trees stood tall and familiar, and for a while it felt like old times. Out here, he didn't think about the bills piling up or the silence growing louder in his own home. Out here, it was just him. As evening came, the woods grew darker, the kind of dark that pressed in from all sides. George didn't mind. He built a small fire, warmed a can of soup, and settled in. The stars above him were faint, hidden behind a stretch of clouds, and the wind carried a stillness that felt different this time. He couldn't place it, but something about that night didn't sit right. 8 p.m. George stood stretching, planning to head to his tent soon. That's when he heard it. A noise, soft, deliberate behind him. He turned, expecting nothing. Maybe an animal, maybe the wind. But what he saw wasn't either. A shadow stepped into view, just at the edge of the firelight. George barely had time to register the figure before it moved. Quick. Silent. The first blow came fast, catching him on the side of the head. He stumbled, the world spinning. A second hit dropped him to his knees. He gasped, reaching out, trying to find something, someone. But no one was there. The third strike sent him face first into the dirt, and the fourth was just to make sure. Heavy. Final. And then nothing. The figure stood over him for a moment, breathing hard, then backed away, disappearing into the trees as if they'd never been there. George lay still, the fire flickering beside him, the night swallowing the last of his strength. Hours passed. Cold crept in. His breath slowed. But he wasn't gone. Not yet. Miles away, Christina sat on the couch, legs tucked under her, flipping through channels without watching. She hadn't called him all day. Hadn't asked when he'd be back. To anyone else, it might have seemed strange. Her calm. But to Christina, everything was falling into place. She turned off the TV, walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine, and waited. Meanwhile, a trucker, heading home after a long haul, decided to take a back road he didn't usually use, just trying to save time. The road was rough, narrow, barely lit, but he knew it well enough. That's when he saw something. Something lying just off the side. At first, he thought it was a deer. Maybe something hit and left behind. But as he slowed down, the shape became clearer. A man. The driver stopped, jumped out, ran over. George was barely breathing, blood covering his face, his hands cold. The driver didn't wait. He called 911, shouting into the phone, begging them to hurry. Paramedics arrived minutes later, working fast to stabilize him. George's pulse was weak, his eyes unfocused, but he was alive. At the scene, police officers scanned the area. No tire marks near George's truck. No sign of a struggle beyond the immediate clearing. His wallet was still in his jacket. His watch still on his wrist. His truck untouched. His phone left behind in the glove compartment. Nothing was taken. Nothing, except the peace he once knew. The ambulance lights cut through the night as they sped down the empty road. George lying still on the stretcher, a mask over his face, machines doing what his body no longer could. The paramedics worked in silence, their eyes focused, their movements quick but careful. They had seen injuries like this before, but something about this one was different. There was no explanation, no witness, no story to fill the gaps. Just a man, found barely alive, and no one to speak for him. By the time they reached the hospital, the doctors were ready. They moved him straight into the trauma room, a team surrounding him, calling out stats, running tests. But it didn't take long for the truth to settle in. The scans told them what George couldn't. Severe brain trauma. Swelling. No response. By 1:30 a.m., the diagnosis was clear. Brain dead. A nurse made the call. Christina answered on the second ring. She didn't ask for details. She didn't ask what had happened. She just asked where he was. When Christina arrived at the hospital, she walked through the emergency room doors with steady steps, her face blank, her hands still. A doctor met her in the hallway, spoke gently, explained everything. George wasn't conscious. He couldn't breathe on his own. The machines were keeping him alive. They had done all they could. Christina listened, nodded, no tears, no questions. She was taken to his room, where George lay surrounded by wires and tubes, his chest rising and falling in a slow, unnatural rhythm. Most people would have broken down at the sight. Most would have clutched his hand, begged him to wake up. To fight. She signed for his life support to be taken off, saying he wouldn't want this. He told me, if anything ever happened, he wanted to go in peace. The doctors asked if she needed more time to think, to call someone. She declined. By sunrise, the paperwork was signed. Loretta Allen sat alone in the hospital chapel, her hands clasped tightly, her eyes fixed on the floor. The doctors had told her there was nothing they could do. Christina had already made the decision. George was gone. But something inside Loretta wouldn't let her accept it, not like this. She had known her son all his life. She had raised him to be careful, to think things through. George wouldn't have left her like this, not without a fight. And Christina? She didn't shed a single tear. Not one. Loretta watched her walk through the halls, as if nothing had changed. She signed the forms like it was just another day. Loretta knew something wasn't right. She felt it in her bones. At the funeral, Christina wore black, stood at the front, accepted the condolences. But there was something hollow in her voice, something empty in her eyes. Simon stood close, too close, his head down, barely speaking to anyone. Loretta watched them both. Watched how they avoided her gaze, how they seemed connected somehow, in a way she couldn't explain. That night, Loretta made a promise to herself. She wasn't letting this go. She called the police, again and again, until someone listened. She told them everything. About Christina. About the money. About the life insurance. She asked the questions no one else was asking. Why was George attacked but not robbed? Why was so quick to pull the plug? Why did Simon suddenly leave town? Detectives went back to the scene, this time with fresh eyes. They combed through the woods near Pine Ridge, looking for anything they might have missed. That's when they found it. A glove. Torn, dirty, half buried under a pile of leaves not far from where George had been found. It was out of place, too new to belong in the woods. They sent it for testing, hoping it would lead to something. Anything. While they waited, they dug deeper into Christina's life. Her bank records told a story of their own. Maxed out credit cards, cash withdrawals, purchases that didn't make sense. And just days before George's death, a payment on a second life insurance policy, one George never signed. Simon's alibi didn't hold either. He said he had been with his sister, but when detectives called, she told them he never showed. She hadn't seen him in weeks. Then the results came back. DNA on the glove. Simon Reed. They found Simon 2 days after the DNA results came in, hiding out at a friend's house on the outskirts of town. When the detectives knocked, he didn't run. He didn't even ask why they were there. He just opened the door, his face pale, his eyes tired, like he'd been carrying the weight of something too heavy for too long. At the station, it didn't take much. Simon sat in the small, cold interview room, his hands shaking, his voice barely more than a whisper. At first, he denied everything. Said he didn't know what they were talking about. Said the glove wasn't his. But when they placed the evidence in front of him, the glove, the timeline, the gaps in his alibi, something in him cracked. His shoulders slumped, and the words started to come. He told them about Christina. About the late nights, the whispered promises. How she made him feel like he was more than just a kid living in someone else's home. She told him he was special, that they were meant to be together. But there was one thing in their way. George. Simon said she talked about it for weeks. About the money. About how they could start over. Just the two of them. She told him George was miserable. That he wanted to die. That ending his life would be a mercy. Simon didn't believe her at first. He didn't want to. But every time he tried to pull away, Christina pulled him back in. She said we'd be free, Simon whispered, tears in his eyes. She said we could go anywhere, do anything. That she loved me. The room was silent as Simon confessed to everything. The plan, the night in the woods, the way she convinced him that George wouldn't fight back, that he wouldn't feel a thing. When the detectives asked if Christina had helped him carry it out, Simon shook his head. She didn't have to, he said. She knew I would do it. She knew I loved her. They arrested Christina the next morning. She didn't resist. She didn't ask why. When they read her the charges, conspiracy to commit murder, manipulation of a minor, fraud, she just stood there, her face blank, her eyes cold, no emotion, no words, just silence. At the station she refused to speak. No statement, no denial, nothing. The courtroom was full, but it felt cold, silent. People gathered not just for justice, but for answers. Answers to questions no one wanted to ask out loud. How did a young man lose his way so completely? How did a woman turn a house into a trap, a marriage into a death sentence? And for Loretta Allen, sitting in the front row with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, it was a day she never wanted to see. Simon sat at the defense table, head down, dressed in a suit that didn't quite fit. His face pale, hollowed out by months of waiting. When they called his name, he stood, barely able to hold his own weight. He didn't fight the charges. He didn't deny his role. The judge read the sentence slowly, each word sinking deeper than the last. 30 years in prison. 30 years to think about the life he took, the trust he broke, and the woman who led him there. Simon didn't speak. He just nodded, eyes fixed on the floor, as if looking up would break him completely. Then it was Christina's turn. She walked into the courtroom like she was attending another event. Her expression calm, her eyes as empty as they had been the day George died. She showed no remorse, no fear, no sign that anything inside her had changed. The prosecution laid out the case, piece by piece. The manipulation, the lies, the promise of love twisted into something deadly. The jury didn't take long. Life without parole. She didn't flinch. As the verdict was read, Loretta sat still, tears slipping down her face, her body trembling with a pain too deep for words. She had lost her only son, the boy she raised alone. The man who had trusted too much, loved too hard. She buried him without the chance to say goodbye, without the chance to stop what she had feared from the beginning. After the trial, the crowd slowly left. The reporters, the spectators, the faces she didn't know, they all faded away. But Loretta stayed, sitting on that hard wooden bench, staring at the empty space where George should have been, where his voice, his smile, his life should have stayed. Justice was served, the papers said. But for Loretta, justice didn't bring her son back. It didn't fill the silence in her home. It didn't mend the pieces of a heart that had given everything and lost. George Allen believed in love. He believed in family. He believed that if you gave someone your heart, your loyalty, your life, they would cherish it, protect it, hold it as sacred. He believed in second chances. He believed in building something real, something lasting. But trust, when given blindly, when handed over without question, can cost more than just money, more than pride. It can cost everything. He didn't see the danger living under his roof. He didn't see the hands that reached for him, not with love, but with greed. He didn't see the boy he helped raise, caught between confusion and desire, between loyalty and betrayal. George saw the good in people. He saw the best in Christina, even when she gave him nothing but reasons to doubt. And in the end, it was that trust, the belief that love was enough, that led him down a path he couldn't walk back from. Story 3. September 7th, 2017 was supposed to be a moment of celebration. The kind of evening people remember for the rest of their lives. Laughter echoing off the walls. Champagne toasts. Families reunited under soft lights and expensive linen. Music filled the air. Gentle. Rehearsed. Full of promises. But something unbelievable happened, and when the police got to the location, the person responsible did not run or cry. She waited because this moment didn't start here, in this room, with flashing lights and trembling hands. It started years ago, with love that cost her everything, with sacrifice that was never seen, with heartbreak no one believed, because she never made it loud. Saad Wilkins was born on January 14, 1985, in southwest Atlanta. She was the first of 3 children raised by her mother, Marcia Wilkins, a woman who worked the overnight shift at Grady Memorial Hospital for 16 straight years without missing a single week. There was no father in the just Marcia, a pile of unpaid bills, and a house that creaked during storms but never collapsed because she refused to let it. Saad learned early how to stretch a dollar. She clipped coupons before she was tall enough to reach the top kitchen shelf. She walked her siblings to school when her mother couldn't. And when they cried about the lights going out again, she made it an adventure. Lit candles, told stories, sang to them until they forgot the dark. She was always singing. By age 7, her voice was already drawing attention at church. The pastor called her Little Mahalia. At Carver Elementary, she joined the music program where she memorized every part, alto, soprano, and even harmony when needed. But she was more than just a voice. Saad was sharp, focused. Teachers called her a natural leader. She hated missing school and couldn't stand group projects where others didn't try as hard as she did. By middle school, she was tutoring other kids after class. Not because she was told to, but because she couldn't stand to watch them fall behind. She understood what it meant to feel forgotten. At South Atlanta High School, Saad joined everything. Choir, student government, debate team. She won the citywide poetry slam at 15. She graduated with honors at 17. Her classmates voted her most likely to succeed. But success always came with a price. While other students were going to prom, Saad was picking up night shifts at Waffle House to help cover rent. Her first paycheck bought groceries. Her second paid for a used laptop so she could apply to colleges. She got accepted into Clark Atlanta University, her dream school, but turned it down. The tuition gap was too wide and her mother needed help. Instead, she enrolled in Georgia State University part-time and took on 2 jobs, working retail during the day and assisting at a daycare in the evenings. Even then, she never lost the music. Every Sunday, she directed the youth choir at her church. Every Friday night, she performed at open mics around the city, her voice filling small rooms with big dreams. She talked about starting a music school one day, someplace inner-city kids could go after class, not just to learn notes and keys, but to be heard, to find their own sound in a world that often tried to mute them. Saad didn't party. She didn't date much either. Most of the men she met couldn't keep up with her pace or couldn't handle her independence, and the few who tried wanted her to slow down. But Saad didn't know how. She was always moving forward, always building, even when no one else saw what she was working toward. Saad didn't fall for Marcus overnight. It was slow, natural, like the way you forget the exact moment summer ends and fall begins. He made her feel seen, and she hadn't felt that in a long time. He'd listen to her sing at open mic nights and say she had a gift. He told her she was the kind of woman who made men better. She believed that. She needed to. Her mother wasn't thrilled. Don't carry a man that won't walk, she once warned. But Saad was stubborn. She told herself he was just stuck, not lazy. He just needed time, not rescuing. And besides, who else would believe in him if she didn't? She started skipping auditions for weekend jobs, pushed her music school plans aside to work longer hours. When his car broke down, she paid for the repairs. When he couldn't make rent, she wrote the check. And when he said he wanted to go back to school to get his business degree, she filled out the paperwork for him and footed the bill. By the end of the second year, Saad had nothing left in her account, but she felt like they were building something. Marcus had moved into her apartment by then. He didn't contribute much financially, but he always had a way with words. Every time she got frustrated, he'd say, "I'm doing this for us. You'll see." And Saad needed to believe that every sacrifice she made was a step towards something real. The logistics business started small, Marcus running packages for small companies across the city. She made flyers, built a basic website, paid for gas and insurance. When he brought in his first big contract, he said, "We made it. Not I, we." And that was enough to quiet the part of her that had started to ask, "What about me?" There was no proposal, no ring, but she didn't press. He said, "Once I can give you a proper wedding, you'll get the life you deserve." So she waited, and worked, and poured more into him. More time, more energy, more of herself. He started traveling more, meeting with clients, staying overnight in different cities. When she'd ask about it, he'd say, "You want me to make money, right?" It always ended with her apologizing, feeling guilty. He had a way of turning questions into accusations, a way of making her feel like asking for clarity was the same as doubting him. Her friends started pulling back. Some said they couldn't watch her disappear into his life anymore. One called him a leech. Saad cut her off. Loyalty, she believed, meant sticking beside someone through the hard parts, even when it hurt, even when it felt one-sided. She told herself, once he's stable, he'll remember who helped him get there. By year 5, Marcus was wearing designer clothes and posting motivational quotes online. He had thousands of followers, a new SUV, and a growing client base. But at home, things were shifting. He no longer complimented her cooking, no longer asked about her day. When she brought up her dream of starting a youth choir again, he rolled his eyes and said, "We're not in college anymore. Grow up." She laughed it off, but her chest tightened. At 28, Saad felt older than her age. She'd stopped singing, stopped writing. Her world had shrunk to work, bills, and Marcus. And somehow he was still the center of it. She started noticing little things. Locked screens. Late night calls he took in the bathroom. Makeup smudges on his shirts that didn't belong to her. When she asked him about it, he accused her of being insecure. "You need to stop making things up in your head. This is why I don't talk to you anymore." She apologized again. One night, after cooking his favorite meal, she asked him plainly, "Are we still moving toward marriage?" Marcus looked at her for a long time, then said, "You're pressuring me. That's not attractive." And that was the end of the conversation. But she stayed because she had already given him everything. Because she kept thinking, if she just held on a little longer, he'd finally choose her. By then, the love didn't feel warm anymore. It felt cold, transactional. But Saad didn't know how to stop giving. She didn't know how to ask for more without feeling like she was asking for too much. When she turned 33, they didn't celebrate. Marcus was out of town, supposedly. She spent the evening alone, looking through old journals, flipping past pages filled with plans for a life that never came. A friend once told her, "You don't get a badge for suffering. Love shouldn't feel like survival." Saad hadn't believed her then. But now she wasn't sure. And still she stayed. Because walking away from him felt like walking away from the last version of herself that still had hope. But hope was fading, and something else was starting to take its place. She found out she was pregnant on a Wednesday morning. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even something they'd talked about. She had been feeling dizzy for days, throwing up in the mornings, blaming it on the stress of juggling work and school. But the second that pink line appeared, she didn't panic. She smiled. Alone in that tiny apartment bathroom, she held the test to her chest and whispered, "Okay, okay." She waited 2 days before telling Marcus. He had been distant that week, distracted with a new courier contract and complaining about how tight money was. She made dinner first, his favorite jerk chicken and rice with plantains, and waited until they were done eating. Then she said it gently like something fragile. "I think I'm pregnant." He blinked, fork still in hand. "Are you sure?" She nodded. He leaned back in his chair, wiped his mouth and said, "Well, maybe it's not the right time. Let's not get ahead of ourselves." That was it. No hug, no smile, just a sentence that landed like a cold gust across her chest. But she didn't fight it. She said she understood. She pretended she wasn't disappointed. She made tea for both of them after dinner and sat with him on the couch, hoping he'd change his tone. He didn't. She kept going to work every day, 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. at the call center, then 5 to 9 at the after-school program. She skipped lunch breaks to read pregnancy forums. She rubbed coconut oil on her belly at night, humming lullabies under her breath. She downloaded a baby names app and bookmarked cribs online. But she told no one. Not her mother, not her sisters, not even her best friend, Latasha. It was her little secret, a quiet hope she was afraid to out loud in case the silence swallowed it whole. Then 2 weeks later it happened. She was at work taking a call from an irate customer when a sharp pain gripped her lower back. She tried to ignore it, sat straighter, sipped water, kept typing. But the pain intensified. It crawled across her abdomen, hot and heavy, until she excused herself and walked stiffly toward the bathroom. By the time she locked the stall door, she was already bleeding. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stood there staring down until the shock wore off and the shaking began. 10 minutes later she cleaned herself up, flushed away what she couldn't bear to look at, and walked back to her desk like nothing happened. She finished her shift, went home. Didn't tell Marcus until the next night. Even then she said it with a smile. "I think I lost it, but maybe that means it just wasn't meant to be." He shrugged. "You sure you were really pregnant?" That question sat in her throat for weeks. She started blaming herself. Maybe it was the long hours, the stress, the cheap takeout meals. Maybe her body just wasn't strong enough. She went online typing in words she never thought she'd search. Early miscarriage signs. Chances of getting pregnant again. Why do some women lose babies without warning? But life didn't pause for answers. Rent was still due. Marcus still needed rides to meetings. The logistics business was picking up, and she didn't want to be a burden. So she kept quiet. She stuffed the sadness into the same drawer where her business plans now gathered dust. And she moved on. A few months later they tried again. Not because he suggested it, but because she needed to believe she could carry something to term. She needed to prove to herself that she wasn't broken. She tracked her ovulation, took vitamins, ate better. She even started seeing a midwife on weekends, paying out of pocket. But the second time ended like the first. Before the first trimester. This one happened at night. She had just fallen asleep when the cramps woke her. She didn't want to wake Marcus, so she curled up in the bathroom, clutching a towel, whispering, "Please, not again." When it was over, she lay on the tile floor until sunrise. Marcus didn't notice the blood-stained sheets. Didn't ask why she winced when she moved. And when she told him finally 2 days later, he sighed and said, "Maybe we're rushing it. Let's focus on the business for now." That was the moment she learned to stop expecting comfort from him. Still she stayed. Still she hoped. She bought a small journal and began writing letters to the babies she lost. She gave them names, dated the pages, apologized when she couldn't protect them, prayed over the blank spaces, hoping one day she could fill them with good news. By the time the third miscarriage happened, she had stopped telling him right away. She would wait days, sometimes weeks. And when she did say it, she would say it flatly, like someone reading a weather report. "I lost another one." He would nod, maybe touch her arm. But that was it. The one time he offered real comfort, he said, "You're strong. You'll get through it. You always do." It was meant as a compliment, but it felt like a sentence. Like he was already excusing himself from the pain, because she'd learned how to carry it without falling apart. Each loss chipped away at her, not just her body, but her identity. She began seeing herself less as a partner and more as a placeholder. Someone keeping the seat warm for whoever he'd become when success finally arrived. And when that success came in 2014, with new contracts, big checks, and a company that finally stood on its own feet, Side-Eye was no longer the dream. She was the history. She had helped build the house. But he was already planning to fill it with someone else. And she didn't know it yet. But the cracks were already widening. Latasha Green had always been the life of the room. Loud laugh, long nails, and a confidence that made people turn their heads when she walked in. She and Side-Eye met in their second year at Georgia State, both studying part-time, both holding down jobs, both women who knew how to take care of themselves. What bonded them wasn't just shared ambition, but quiet loyalty. Side-Eye was the thinker, the steady hand. Latasha was the fire. Together, they balanced each other. They remained close after graduation. When Latasha got pregnant at 25 and her boyfriend disappeared, Side-Eye was the one who showed up to every prenatal appointment. She was there in the delivery room, held her son first. And when Latasha was tired, Side-Eye babysat for free, even after long shifts. It wasn't a favor. It was family. So when Marcus started pulling away emotionally, it felt natural for Latasha to fill that gap. She'd stop by with takeout when Side-Eye hadn't eaten, bring her Epsom salts after another failed pregnancy, sit with her in bed and scroll through old photos, reminding her who she used to be before the sadness became her shadow. Marcus didn't say much at first, but Side-Eye noticed how he'd the room longer when Latasha came by. How his cologne seemed stronger. How he laughed harder at her jokes than he had in years. She chalked it up to him being starved for connection, the way she was. But the shift in energy was unmistakable. By the end of 2016, Latasha was coming over unannounced. She'd say she was in the area, that she just needed to drop something off. But she'd stay for hours, helping cook, laughing on the couch, sipping wine with Marcus while Side-Eye folded laundry down the hall. Sometimes, Side-Eye would come out of the bedroom and find them mid-conversation, their voices hushed. They'd stop talking when they saw her, then start up again like nothing happened. She told herself it was in her head, that maybe she was just exhausted, maybe grief had turned her suspicious. But then came that moment. Just one. Small but sharp. Side-Eye walked in from the kitchen one evening and saw Marcus and Latasha sitting on the couch. Her son was asleep in the spare room. The TV was on, muted. Marcus said something and Latasha laughed, not the kind of laugh you give a friend, but the kind that hangs too long in the air. Then Marcus looked up and saw Side-Eye. His face didn't flinch, but Latasha's eyes dropped immediately. That was the moment. The one Side-Eye couldn't ignore. Later that night after Latasha left, she asked Marcus directly, "Do you like her?" He blinked, annoyed. "She's like a sister. Don't start with that insecure nonsense." When she asked Latasha the next day, Latasha looked offended. "I would never do that to you," she said. "You're like blood to me." And Side-Eye believed them, because the alternative was too painful to process. But things didn't go back to normal. Marcus started being out of town more often, only now without details. Sidey would find strange charges on the joint credit card. Hotel rooms she never saw. Restaurants she had never been to. He always had an answer, but it never quite added up. Latasha became distant too. She stopped calling every day. She started taking longer to respond to texts. She missed birthdays. She stopped asking about the next pregnancy attempt, the way she always used to. When they did speak, it was short, surface-level, quick check-ins, then excuses to go. Still, Sidey didn't confront them again. Instead, she shrunk into herself. She started journaling again. Not letters to lost children this time, but questions she couldn't say out loud. She kept them in a notebook hidden in the back of her closet. Why does he feel further away when he's sitting right beside me? Why do I feel like I'm the one intruding in my own home? Why does her name taste bitter when I say it now? She thought about walking away. Thought about packing a suitcase and leaving everything behind. But 12 years is heavy. You don't walk away from that without feeling like your own body's been carved in half. So she stayed. One night, she opened the fridge and found a half-eaten takeout container. Thai food. Marcus hated Thai food. Latasha didn't. She sat down at the kitchen table, stared at it, and felt her chest go tight. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just sat there for 20 minutes, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the silence. And in that stillness, a quiet truth settled over her. She was sharing her life with two people who had already left her. They just hadn't told her yet. One evening, Saad came home early from a shift. She found Marcus on a video call, shirtless, smiling, saying, "I miss you too." When he saw her, he ended the call and said it was a client. She didn't believe him, but she had no proof. The following week was supposed to be the final appointment. A checkup. Routine. But she had collapsed near the copy machine at work. 1 minute she was standing. The next, she was on the floor, dizzy and drenched in sweat. Her coworkers calling her name like it was floating away. The hospital ran a full scan. That's when they found it. Internal scarring. The result of multiple failed pregnancies, untreated infections, stress. The doctor didn't say it harshly. He said it slowly, carefully. "You may still conceive, but carrying to term will be extremely difficult now. I'm sorry." She sat in the examination room with the paper gown folded across her lap, staring at the 4 in her arm, wondering if this was the moment her future officially ended. Marcus didn't answer her call. She waited until she got home to tell him in person. She rehearsed it on the ride there, tried to frame it as just another challenge they could face together. She even laughed once, nervously, as she imagined how he might take her hand and say, "We'll figure this out." But when she said the words, "They don't think I can carry again," he didn't even look up from his phone. He just nodded, and after a few seconds, without emotion, said, "Maybe God's telling us something." It felt like someone had shut the window in her chest. He left the apartment that night with a duffel bag. Said he was staying with a cousin while he got his thoughts together. She knew he was lying, but she didn't ask where he was going. She didn't beg him to stay. She went to bed with her shoes still on. Over the next few weeks, he came and went on his own schedule. Some nights, he'd sleep at home. Other times, he'd show up in the morning, grab a change of clothes, and leave again without speaking more than 3 words. He didn't ask how she was healing. Didn't mention the appointment, the baby, the future. When she did speak, it was forced. Empty lines like, "Did you eat? Or do you need anything ironed?" He'd grunt, shrug, tap on his phone. And the silence between them widened like a canyon she no longer knew how to cross. She stopped cooking, stopped cleaning. Her favorite gospel records gathered dust beside the speaker. The curtain stayed closed for weeks. She quit the church choir without warning. Told them she just needed time. But the truth was, she couldn't sing with a voice that had nothing left to say. Latasha texted once. Asked if she was okay. Said didn't reply. She started going through Marcus' things while he was gone. Phone bills. Credit card statements. She found a second phone tucked into his briefcase. Locked. She held it in her hand for almost an hour before setting it back down. It was confirmation, but she didn't need it anymore. She already knew. Then came the photograph, folded and wedged between paperwork on his desk. A printed picture, not digital. Marcus and Latasha, dressed up, standing too close. The background was a rooftop bar she'd never been to. The time stamp said it was taken 3 weeks earlier. On the same day she had passed out at work. She didn't cry. She just stared at it, traced their outlines with her finger, then tucked it into her Bible. She didn't leave him. Not yet. She started documenting everything. Kept receipts. copied emails, backed up texts. She created a folder on her laptop labeled MISC. Inside it, she saved screenshots, phone logs, bank transactions. She stared at the envelope like it was a joke someone forgot to finish. It was cream-colored, embossed with gold edges, and sealed with a delicate heart-shaped sticker. Inside, a glossy photo of Marcus and Latasha, smiling, posed, holding hands against a lakeside backdrop. Below their names the words, "Together with their families, we invite you to celebrate our love." And then it hit her like a slap. September 7th, 2017. She reread the date. Once, twice, 3 times. That date had no meaning to them. Not before. He hadn't chosen it for sentimental value. He had chosen it because it was convenient. Because it worked with their venue and the catering schedule. Because he could. The invitation wasn't even addressed to her. It was sent to her younger sister Jasmine. Folded neatly in a pile of mail, it slipped out when she wasn't expecting it. Jasmine hadn't opened it yet, but now Saad had seen it. And that was enough. 12 years. 12 years of picking up after him. Lying for him. Waiting for him to become the man he promised he would be. And he gave the proposal. The ring. The wedding. To someone who had once wept beside her as she bled through her 5th miscarriage. Someone who sat on her couch and promised, "You're the only one he'll ever love." Saad didn't scream. She didn't throw the card. She didn't call anyone. She folded it neatly, slid it back into the envelope, set it on the kitchen counter, and then she sat down, not to cry, not to pray, not to question. She began writing. The first list was names, people she hadn't spoken to in years, former coworkers, church friends, women she once confided in but drifted from. She jotted them down not because she needed their help, but because she needed to remember who she used to be. The girl who built things, the woman who served others, the person who was known for her voice, her purpose, her plans. Then she made another list. Locations, dates, key moments, the first miscarriage, the night she paid his tuition in full, the time he forgot her birthday and blamed stress, the hotel charges, the lipstick on the collar, the fake conferences, the time she found Latasha's earring behind the couch. Every wound had a timestamp. Every scar had a record. She wasn't planning revenge. She was planning clarity, truth, written out, because something in her had clicked. Not all at once. Not like lightning. More like a long-held breath that finally gave out. He had taken her youth, her health, her identity, and now he wanted to stand before God and everyone they knew, and pretend none of it had ever happened. She began rehearsing what she would say if given the chance. Just one moment, one audience, one silence loud enough to make them listen. But the words didn't come in anger. They came in peace. Still, sharp, focused. Over the next few days, Saad moved differently. She went back to church, not for the sermon, but to sit in the back pew. Unseen. To feel the weight of stained glass and quiet. She visited her old college building. Walked through the music wing. Sat outside the rehearsal room, where she once dreamed about starting her school. And every night, she stood in front of her bathroom mirror and looked herself in the eye. Not to check her makeup, but to find what was left of her. By mid-August, she knew what she would wear. She found the dress in a thrift store. Ivory silk. Simple cut. No frills. The kind of dress you wear when you want people to ask questions but not speak them out loud. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting. She didn't buy a gun right away. She didn't know yet what the ending would be. But something inside her was shifting so deeply, so completely, that the world began to feel quieter. Not numb, not empty, just resolved. On September 5th, she booked a salon appointment. Asked for soft curls and a natural finish. She bought a new purse. One just large enough. She didn't RSVP. She didn't text Latasha. She didn't warn Marcus. She would be there. And for once, finally, it would be on her terms. The dress would be white, but it wouldn't mean what they thought. September 7th, 2017 was warm. Not hot enough to sweat, but warm enough to keep the windows cracked in the early hours. The venue, a grand ballroom just outside Atlanta, sat tucked between manicured hedges and a marble fountain that glistened as if someone had polished it just for the occasion. It was the kind of place that hosted law firm anniversaries and private galas. The kind of place Sadhead used to dream she'd get married in. By noon, the decorators had finished tying white satin bows to every chair. Silver runners lined the tables. The florist had placed ivory orchids around the base of the wedding arch. A gospel choir rehearsed softly in the back garden. They were set to perform during the couple's first dance, an idea Latasha had claimed was hers, though Saad knew exactly where she got it from. She had talked about it once, years ago, when she and Marcus were still together. Back when forever still felt possible. Guests began arriving around 4. Most wore pastels or shades of champagne. The men sported pocket squares. The women carried small clutches and fake smiles. Marcus' business associates occupied the front row. Latasha's cousins filled an entire table near the bar. Laughter echoed through the hallway, the kind that always floats through weddings. Nervous, excited, practiced. Marcus arrived in a custom-tailored white tuxedo with black lapels. His hair cut fresh, his beard lined precisely. He shook hands, hugged uncles, took photos like a man proud of what he had built. And he had built something. At least, that's how it looked from the outside. A 6-figure company. A new house in the suburbs. And now finally a wife. Latasha came in later, flanked by bridesmaids, holding a bouquet of white roses and baby's breath. Her dress was tight, strapless, modern. Her son, now 7, walked her down the aisle. The room clapped as if they were watching a movie. People dabbed tears they weren't sure how to explain. Some said, they've been through so much. Others whispered, they deserve this. No one mentioned Saad. She wasn't on the guest list, but she was already there. She arrived late, parked 3 streets over, walked past valet with quiet confidence, slipping through the side entrance just after the couple had said their vows. She wore white, not bridal white, but close enough. A simple dress, clean, no jewelry, hair styled neatly, her makeup light, her expression calm. Inside, no one stopped her. A few guests turned their heads. A few more stared. One of Marcus's aunties tapped the next woman beside her and whispered, "Is that her?" Someone else leaned forward, eyes wide, but no one said anything out loud. They assumed the same thing. She had come to forgive, to rise above, to prove something, to herself, to them, to God. Even Marcus's mother smiled at her, a strained, confused smile, the kind meant for people who might still explode. Latasha looked up and froze when she saw her, just for a second, then turned her face back to her husband. The first dance began, the lights dimmed, the gospel choir began humming, the room hushed. Marcus took Latasha's hand. They moved slowly, deliberately. He whispered something in her ear. She laughed. Guests sighed. A photographer captured every second. On the surface, it looked like closure. 2 people stepping into a new chapter, surrounded by family and faith. That's when Saad stepped forward. One guest, Marcus's cousin, smiled and said, "Look at God. She really came to show love." Another whispered, "She's stronger than most." She walked across the dance floor in silence. No music, just footsteps. And then she reached into her purse. It wasn't a gift. It wasn't a letter. It was a gun. And in a matter of seconds, everything that looked like a celebration shattered. She shot both of them, Marcus on the forehead and Latasha in the heart. Saad didn't flinch when the screaming started. She didn't duck. She didn't turn around. The moment the second shot rang out, chaos erupted. But she didn't move. Guests stampeded for the exits. Dishes crashed. A man knocked over the wedding cake, trying to pull his daughter under the table. Someone yelled for help, another for God. One of Latasha's bridesmaids collapsed to the floor. Her voice cracked and broken from sobbing. And Saad just stood there. She stood over their bodies in silence, the music still cut mid-melody, the echoes of the choir frozen in the ceiling. The gun, still warm, hung from her hand at her side, not clenched, not ready for more. Just there. She could have run. The side doors were wide open. The security guards hadn't even made it to her yet. There was at least 40 full seconds of confusion, of blind panic, where she could have slipped away into the parking lot, into the trees, into the city. But she didn't. She stepped back 2 paces from where Marcus lay, kneeled gently, still calm, and placed the weapon on the floor. Then she stood upright, took one deep breath, and raised both hands in the air. No one told her to do it. No one needed to. Some guests were still crying. Others had backed themselves into corners, whispering prayers, trying to understand what they had just seen. But the screaming had softened now. Because everyone could see, she wasn't a threat anymore. She wasn't trying to hurt anyone else. She wasn't there to escape. She was waiting. The first police unit arrived 6 minutes after the 911 call. By then, the wedding hall was almost empty. Dozens stood outside, shielding their eyes from the flashing lights, watching through glass doors. Inside, Seda remained exactly where she'd been, alone on the dance floor, the white dress now stained at the sleeve. her shoes still clean, her face unreadable. The officers entered with weapons drawn. They shouted commands. Standard procedure. On the ground. Hands where we can see them. She didn't argue. She turned slowly, got to her knees, laid down flat. "I'm not resisting," she said. "It's done." Her voice was low, steady. They cuffed her quickly, patted her down, cleared her purse, asked if she had more weapons. She said no, asked if she was injured. She said no. One officer looked into her eyes as they lifted her off the floor. She didn't avoid his gaze. She didn't cry. In the report, he later wrote, she wasn't cold. She wasn't angry. She was still. Too still. As they walked her out through the entrance, through the same space where guests had once taken photos under silk drapes and flower arches, everyone stared. Some held phones up. Some hid behind loved ones. Some just watched her, silently, as if trying to recognize something familiar in a face they thought they knew. And through all of it, Saad never said a word. She didn't speak to the officers. She didn't beg for forgiveness. She didn't look at the cameras or flinch at the flashing lights. Because she wasn't surprised that it ended like this. The surprise for her had ended years ago. What was left now was silence and accountability. February 7th, 2018. The courtroom was packed by sunrise. Outside, news vans lined the block. Satellite dishes pointed to the sky. Reporters rehearsed live shots in the cold, their breath fogging as they spoke into microphones. The words double homicide, wedding day, and white dress shooter passed from network to network like a baton in a race no one wanted to win. Inside, the tension was thick before the judge ever took the bench. Security was doubled. Everyone was searched twice. Metal detectors beeped at every belt buckle, every necklace clasp. No phones allowed. No cameras. Just seats, silence, and 100 eyes waiting for the door to open. When Saad Wilkins was brought into the room, the sound of feet shifting and whispered gasps swept through the gallery like wind through dry grass. She wore state-issued beige. Her hands were cuffed in front of her. She walked slowly, chin high, eyes forward. People expected her to look broken. She didn't. She didn't look angry either. She looked finished. The judge read through the charges. 2 counts of first-degree murder, unlawful possession of a firearm, public endangerment. Court was officially in session. The prosecutor stood with confidence, a seasoned attorney, clean-cut, precise, and already calling it one of the most clear-cut executions he had ever handled. She planned it, he told the jury. She brought the dress. She brought the gun. She waited until they danced before she pulled the trigger. This wasn't heartbreak. This was intention. He pointed to the autopsy reports. Marcus Darnell, shot once in the chest, died within 60 seconds. Latasha Green, shot through the upper chest, bullet pierced a lung, death pronounced en route to the hospital. No third shot. No wildfiring. 2 bullets. 2 bodies. The courtroom was silent as he placed wedding photos into evidence. The ones from just minutes before it happened. Images of Marcus and Latasha smiling under chandelier light. The kind of pictures you frame. The kind you never imagined being used in a murder trial. Saad didn't look away. When the defense stood, they didn't deny what she had done. They laid it out plainly. Yes, she fired the gun. Yes, she brought it into that building. But what they asked the jury to consider was what came before that. They showed hospital records, 6 documented miscarriages, emergency room visits with no partner signatures, OBGYN reports that included scarring likely due to repeated trauma. They brought out pay stubs from Sada's old jobs, call centers, retail stores, night shifts at a diner. Documents proving she covered Marcus's rent, paid his tuition, funded the seed money for his company. Witnesses were called from her past. A college roommate, a former manager, her church choir director. All of them said the same thing. Saad was dependable. Quiet. Kind. A woman who didn't snap. A woman who eroded. Then came the most difficult testimony. Saad herself. When she stood, the room leaned forward. Every breath felt held. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for pity. Her voice was even low and firm. I loved him, she said. That's the part one want you to hear first. I loved him when he had nothing. I loved him through every loss, even when I didn't know how to hold myself together. But I became invisible. And then I became used. The defense attorney asked, what was going through your mind the moment you pulled the trigger? Saad stared at the table in front of her, then said, I wasn't thinking about killing them. I was thinking about how I'd been erased. That they were celebrating something they built with pieces of me. And no one in that room even saw it. Marcus's family shifted in their seats. Latasha's brother clenched his fists. Her mother shook her head and whispered she's cold. Sada's mother, sitting alone in the second row, clutched her daughter's high school photo to her chest. She hadn't spoken to reporters, hadn't spoken to anyone, but now she mouthed something only Saad could see. I'm still here. The prosecution countered with force. They called Saad calculated, claimed she had weeks to walk away, that many people have been left, have been betrayed, and didn't kill. They warned the jury not to normalize vengeance. But public opinion was already divided. The courtroom couldn't contain it. Commentators called it one of the most emotionally complex trials of the decade. The courtroom sketch of Saad testifying was reprinted in newspapers nationwide. When closing arguments began on February 19th, both sides gave everything they had. Prosecution. This was murder in front of 130 people. A woman's rage doesn't make her innocent. Defense. 12 years of silence isn't rage. It's decay. And no one offered her a way out. And then, it was in the jury's hands. June 21st, 2018. The judge's voice didn't shake. He read the sentence like he was reading the time. Measured. Steady. Final. 42 years. No possibility of parole. Saad didn't flinch. She stood still at the defendant's table, hands folded in front of her, eyes forward. She didn't look back at the gallery, didn't scan the room for sympathy. She had already buried every expectation the night she walked into that wedding hall. In the back row, a woman dropped her head into her hands and began to sob. Next to her, someone whispered. They gave her whole life. One man gasped audibly. A juror bit her lips so hard it bled. Latasha's family nodded. Quietly, as if they had waited for this moment to exhale. One of her cousins whispered, finally, under his breath. Sada's mother didn't move. She sat with the same small photo in her lap. Her hands didn't tremble. Her eyes didn't blink. But the image she held, a younger Saad in a college sweatshirt, smiling wide on her first day at Georgia State, stayed pressed against her chest until the bailiff tapped her shoulder. Outside the courthouse, the crowd had doubled. Yellow tape separated protesters from press. Signs waved through the summer heat. She was already buried. 12 years is too long. This system doesn't see women who don't scream. Counter-protesters stood across the street. Murder is still murder. You can't shoot your way to healing. Police stood between them. Cameras rolled nonstop. A reporter from Channel 9 leaned into her mic and said, "Today the justice system sent a message. But the country can't agree on what that message was. For some, it was closure. For others, it was a confirmation that pain, quiet, slow, invisible pain, still holds no weight in court." Inside the courthouse elevator, as she was taken down to holding, Saad finally spoke. Not to the guards. Not to her attorney. She turned to the wall and whispered to no one. It's over. But she was wrong. Because in the months that followed, her name would not disappear. Her story refused to die. Editorials exploded. One headline read, "The trial of Saad Wilkins is not about murder. It's about how long we let women suffer before they break." A best-selling author wrote a feature for The Atlantic, titled, "When Love Becomes a Sentence, The Anatomy of Saad Wilkins." It broke records. College students printed her face on t-shirts. Podcasts dissected every piece of courtroom audio. A documentary crew requested access to court transcripts. Law students wrote papers titled, "Justice and Gender, The Case of Wilkins versus Self." Even people who never met her claimed they saw themselves in her silence, in her exhaustion, in her ending. But Saad didn't know any of that. She spent her first month at Elmhurst Correctional Facility in a segregated unit, away from general population. Not for safety, but for observation. They watched her carefully. Every meal, every movement, every night she didn't sleep. Her journal, the one she started writing the week after her arrest, was now almost full. 72 pages. All handwritten. No rage. No regret. Just one entry for each day. One guard said, "She's the quietest inmate I've ever seen." Another said, "It's like she already served time before she got here." Saad declined all interviews. Turned down book deals. Refused to speak to networks. She wrote to her mother once. Just one sentence. "I don't need freedom to feel finished." No appeals were filed. No clemency requested. And the woman who once waited for a man to choose her had finally chosen herself. In the only way she thought anyone would hear. But the world was still listening. Because what she destroyed wasn't just 2 lives. She destroyed the illusion that long suffering guarantees reward. And now the country had to ask itself, What happens to a woman who stays too long in a house that keeps burning? And what do we call her when she finally walks out, holding the match? Sada's story didn't end the day she was sentenced. It stretched far beyond the courtroom, into living rooms, classrooms, barbershops, and church pews. Anywhere people whispered about love, betrayal, and the thin, dangerous line between devotion and destruction. In the months after her sentencing, her case became more than headlines. It became a mirror. Women especially, mothers, daughters, wives, began asking themselves hard questions. Not about murder, but about endurance. How long they'd waited. How much they'd poured out. How many pieces of themselves they had given away quietly. Without protest. Without thanks. Just to keep a relationship alive that never gave anything back. Men began asking questions too. Some defensive. Others reflective. What does it mean to be loved by someone willing to carry you? And what does it mean when you stop seeing them as a person and start seeing them as a resource? Colleges hosted panels. Clergy rewrote sermons. One high school English teacher assigned Sada's testimony as a writing prompt. The question was simple. Can silence be a kind of death? But inside her prison cell, Sad never saw the discussions. She didn't know about the online communities that dissected her case frame by frame. She wasn't tagged in the thousands of posts bearing her name. She didn't respond to the letters that poured in. From women who had walked away just in time. And from others who hadn't. She kept to herself. She read. She wrote. She taught GED classes to other inmates. Her voice became a lifeline for women behind bars who had never been told they were allowed to matter before they broke. Once, during a class on narrative writing, an inmate asked her if she ever regretted anything. Sad looked down at her notebook, paused, and said, "I regret waiting for someone else to rescue me." There was no bitterness in her tone. No anger. Just truth, sitting heavy in the room. Over the years, no appeal was filed. No motion for early release. She never asked the governor for mercy. And yet, her story wouldn't leave the public consciousness. 10 years later, a journalist published a best-selling book titled The Woman in White. How Sad Wilkins Changed the Way We See Silence. The final chapter included this line: "What Sad did was unforgivable. What was done to her was never seen as a crime." That's the paradox the world still can't solve. Her story made people uncomfortable, because it forced them to confront something most would rather ignore. That pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it cooks dinner, pays bills, smiles for family photos. And then one day it stops pretending. As years passed, the wedding venue changed owners. The fountain was replaced. The ballroom repainted. But staff who were there that night say the floor still carries a faint scar, where the blood had soaked through the wood. They never danced in that room again. And still the story lingers. Because what happened wasn't just the collapse of a triangle. It was a warning. A cautionary tale not about how people break, but how they are broken, over time, in silence, while smiling. Story 4. What keeps a marriage going when there's no love, trust, or basic respect? Some try to hold the family together for the kids, others fear public judgment and care about others' opinions, while some are stopped by religious beliefs or a mix of these factors. But sometimes, the desire to save a marriage at any cost can turn into a horrible tragedy. The story of Jacqueline and Paul Krimble isn't unique, but it drew widespread attention due to its cruelty, greed, and cynicism. The criminal was dubbed the Black Widow and put behind bars, but her daughter confessed in a candid interview that her mother continued to ruin lives even while in prison. The relationship of Jacqueline and Paul Krimble, Jacqueline, or just Jackie Mary Bennett, was born on December 18, 1974, in County Armagh, Northern Ireland, as the youngest of 2 children in an ordinary middle-class family. From childhood, she was erratic, spoiled, defiant, and sometimes even aggressive. In her teenage years, Jackie's behavior got worse, becoming completely unmanageable, but her family blamed it on adolescence, hoping she'd grow out of it. In high school, she met Paul Krimble, who was 3 years older and her complete opposite in every way. But as they say, opposites attract, and this principle seemed to work perfectly here. Paul was a modest and shy young man from a religious family, a good student, considered very talented and promising. Jacqueline's boldness, energy, and confidence attracted him. She was the first, and likely the only, girl he had serious feelings for. Jackie's parents approved of her choice and welcomed Paul, believing he would make their daughter more calm, sensible, and reasonable. Sometimes it seemed like her family treated Paul better than Jackie herself, accepting him as a family member from the day they met. However, Paul's parents were cautious about his choice but didn't stop the young couple's relationship. School friends also noted that the couple seemed incompatible. Jackie often provoked conflicts, preferring to solve them with physical force, while Paul tried to resolve everything peacefully, avoiding violence, and was considered friendly, open, and very responsible. He always kept his word and was ready to help others at any moment, described as a kind, sensible, and mature young man beyond his years. At 17, Jacqueline got pregnant by her boyfriend and immediately told him. At that time, she was in her final school year, and 20-year-old Paul was already a college student. Upon learning this, Paul immediately declared his readiness to marry her and take full responsibility for her and the child. Jacqueline wasn't ready for family life or raising a child, but terminating the pregnancy was out of the question. Neither Paul nor his religious family would allow such a grave sin. So Paul bought a ring and officially proposed to Jackie, who accepted. The couple had a modest wedding in 1992, celebrating with their closest family and friends. Interestingly, a few days before the event, Paul confessed to his best friend that he and Jacqueline were too different in every way, doubted the sincerity of her feelings, and was even afraid of her due to her temper. The groom also doubted whether he truly loved her or just felt sympathy and a sense of duty, but since he never had relationships with other girls, he had nothing to compare. His friend listened attentively and tried to dissuade Paul from marrying, warning him that he might make the biggest mistake of his life and be unhappy forever. However, Paul was determined, saying he couldn't leave a girl expecting his child. Besides, he believed that motherhood would change Jacqueline's character for the better, making her softer and calmer. In general, Paul hoped for the best, but he had no idea how wrong he was. In early 1993, the young couple welcomed their first child, a daughter named Danielle. 6 years later, Jacqueline gave birth to their son, Adam. Paul was the sole provider for his family, ensuring they lacked nothing. After the birth of their second child, the Crimbles decided to find a more spacious home and purchased a cozy 3-bedroom townhouse in Armat, moving in 2000. By then, Paul held a senior mechanical engineer position, earning a solid salary. His wife, however, did not trouble herself with work, claiming she preferred managing the household and raising the children. However, she was not particularly good at either. Jackie was selfish, lazy, quick-tempered, and often showed aggression even towards her children. When the children grew a bit older, Jacqueline tried to find a job, but her quarrelsome and confrontational nature meant she never stayed employed for long. Furthermore, she spent nearly every evening at bars, consuming alcoholic drinks while her husband remained home with their daughter and son. Even when sober, Mrs. Crimble was not the most pleasant person, and under the influence of alcohol, she turned into a real fury. She not only provoked conflicts but also engaged in fights, used foul language, and behaved inappropriately with various men. Any remarks or requests to behave more modestly were met with aggression, and no one could predict what she might do next. Neighbors and family friends were aware of what was happening, and genuinely felt sorry for Paul and the children, who suffered the most from Jacqueline's antics. Since the family lived in a small, quiet town, many people knew about the young woman's escapades and tried to avoid her. Her bad reputation affected her husband and children, who faced repercussions from peers at school. Jackie led a wild lifestyle without trying to hide it, frequently visiting entertainment venues. However, her presence there frightened not only other patrons but also the staff, who knew that her arrival inevitably meant a conflict or fight. Jacqueline kept her family in fear because she could lash out at them at any moment. Paul tried not to complain about the situation, but his friends, family, and colleagues noticed his discomfort around his wife, or even just mentioning her. He was often advised to leave this woman, but Paul feared losing the chance to see his children. In any argument, Jackie would immediately threaten to cut him off from their daughter and son. She also threatened to harm him by involving her acquaintances. These were men she regularly met at bars, who were ready to commit crimes for her sake. Paul usually yielded to his wife in such situations and kept silent. The mysterious attack on Sunday morning, June 20th, 2004, a frightened woman called the emergency services, pleading for help. She claimed that 3 strangers attacked her and her husband in their home, beating them, tying them up, attempting to rob them, and then driving away with their car, taking her husband with them. The caller was Jacqueline Crimble, and police officers and medics immediately rushed to the address she provided. At the house, they found a woman with her hands tied behind her back with a plastic cable tie. However, Her legs were not bound, leading the authorities to believe she had managed to partially free herself. Notably, the victim had no injuries or bruises on her body, even though she initially claimed that the attackers had beaten and tied them up. Fortunately, the couple's children were not at home, as they had been sent to spend the weekend with their paternal grandparents. According to Jacqueline, the previous evening on Saturday, she and her husband had gone to a bar to relax. They drank and returned home after midnight. However, as Paul was opening the front door, 3 figures suddenly jumped out of the darkness and pushed them inside the house. The intruders, brandishing a gun, tied up the couple, beat them, and demanded money and prohibited substances. Allegedly, Paul tried to reason with the criminals, begging them to release him and his wife and promising not to call the police, but this only angered them. They hit him several times and then began to strangle him with a plastic bag in front of the terrified Jacqueline. When it became clear that there was no cash or prohibited substances in the house, the intruders decided to at least steal the car, but for some reason took the owner with them, leaving the bound woman behind. After the criminals drove away with Paul, Jacqueline managed to reach the phone and call the police using her tongue. She was sure her husband might still be alive and begged the detectives to find and save him immediately. However, despite her distress, the woman appeared and acted suspiciously calm, though the authorities had no reason to distrust her at that moment. The mutilated body in the trunk of the couple's car was immediately reported missing throughout the county, and investigators began collecting evidence at the crime scene. They tried to gather any details about the attackers, but Jacqueline claimed that the criminals wore masks. She couldn't recall any distinguishing features like clothing details, speech defects, limping, or anything similar. All she could say was that there were 3 of them, and they were men. By Monday morning, less than a day after the search began, the Krimble family car was found abandoned just 3 miles from the house where the attack had taken place. It was parked in a deserted alley next to a long, vacant house. Inside the trunk was the mutilated body of its owner, bearing clear signs of beating and torture. The 35-year-old man's hands were tied behind his back, his legs bound with a cable tie, and his face and body covered with numerous bruises. When Jackie was informed of the gruesome discovery, she reacted surprisingly calmly. It seemed the brutal deprivation of her husband, the father of her children, didn't bother her much. She tried to feign surprise and pain, but couldn't muster a single tear and literally asked when she would get her car back within a minute. This all appeared very suspicious, prompting law enforcement to take a closer look at the young widow. The main suspect initially, Jacqueline's version, was not questioned and was considered the only credible account. However, the strange behavior of the widowed mother of 2 led law enforcement to suspect she might be lying. Soon it was revealed that her marriage to Paul had been falling apart for a long time, and she was never a model wife and mother. Not only neighbors and acquaintances spoke poorly of her, but even her children and parents. It also came to light that Jackie had been seeing a man named Roger Ferguson for several months. He owned a farm in Armagh where he lived with his mother. She and Krimble were often seen together in various entertainment venues in town, drinking alcohol. Moreover, Roger visited the married woman at her home when her husband was at work and the children were at school and daycare. Just the day after the car with the disfigured body was found, Jacqueline went from victim to the main suspect, and Roger was considered a possible accomplice. The woman did not appear to be a grieving widow and was much more concerned about getting her car back. Furthermore, her account of an attack by a gang of armed addicts sounded implausible. Nothing like this had ever happened in the quiet town before, and where had they gone after abandoning the vehicle with a body in the trunk? Additionally, the mysterious criminals managed to leave no traces, which was also strange. There were no other witnesses who saw suspicious strangers in town. However, almost everyone who ever interacted with the victim spoke negatively about her. Moreover, it soon emerged that the deceased man had an insurance policy, and his wife could expect a large payout of £300,000 sterling in the event of his passing. Now, a real motive had appeared in this case, which could explain the crime. Investigation into the crime. Jacqueline claimed she managed to call for help by dialing on a button phone with her tongue. The device was taken for examination, and indeed, traces of her saliva were found on it. However, at the initial crime scene inspection, investigators noted the phone was on the coffee table face down. With her hands tied behind her back, there was no way she could have turned it over after the call or dialed for help if it was in that position from the start. The couple's home computer search history revealed strange queries. Someone had been looking for information on life insurance, payout amounts, and procedures in the event of the policyholders passing for months. When Jacqueline was directly asked about this, she said she knew nothing and suggested that perhaps Paul was interested in it. Roger Ferguson, who was considered a potential accomplice in the crime, had a rock-solid alibi. His mother claimed he spent the night at home because he wasn't feeling well, and around 1:30 in the morning, she was searching the home medicine cabinet for something to treat his stomach issues. Despite the elderly woman's convincing testimony, they didn't remove her son from the suspect list just yet. Police decided to track the suspect's locations on the night of the crime through their cell phone signals, discovering that Roger had not been home as his mother claimed. Instead, he was at the Crimble's house, where he stayed for several hours. Additionally, he continued his relationship with the widowed woman, and they were seen together at a bar the day after Paul's funeral. Another curious detail was that Jacqueline and Roger visited a car dealership together, where they were looking at SUVs and inquiring about installment plans for such an expensive purchase. Roger's mother was even with them, which seemed even more suspicious. The police suspected that the lovers had already planned how they would spend the insurance payout after Paul's passing, and Roger's mother was likely aware. However, during interrogations, Jackie insisted she never cheated on her husband and certainly didn't wish him harm, but no one believed her anymore. Shortly before the tragedy, Jacqueline had started working as a caregiver in a nursing home, but lasted only a few weeks before being fired due to constant conflicts and lies. Nevertheless, she didn't tell her husband, continuing to pretend she was going to work or had night shifts while staying at Ferguson's house. The deception was accidentally revealed when Paul met one of his wife's former colleagues, who told him everything. He tried to talk to his wife, but this only sparked another argument. She threatened to leave him for her lover, take the children, and forbid their biological father from approaching them. This was Paul's biggest fear, so he agreed to compromise and turned a blind eye to her infidelity. He could only confide in his closest friend, who later testified in court as a witness, recounting Paul's words. The development and execution of a devious plan Roger wasn't particularly smart. He was strong, but somewhat simple-minded and easily led. Jacqueline quickly managed to completely dominate him, manipulating her lover to do her bidding. He would readily get into a fight for her, which flattered her immensely. He was likely genuinely in love with her and believed everything she said. The woman complained to Ferguson about her husband, accusing him of being rude, cruel, and even physically abusive. Naturally, this was all lies, but with each complaint, the lover grew to despise Paul more, believing he was harming and oppressing Jacqueline and was the main obstacle to their happiness together. She implanted the idea in his mind that by eliminating her husband, all their problems would be solved, allowing them to be together while receiving a substantial sum of money for a comfortable life. About 2 weeks before the tragedy, Mrs. Crimble tried to find people willing to commit the crime for money. But after considering several options, she and Roger abandoned the idea. It seemed the lovers decided they could carry it out themselves without leaving evidence or witnesses, ensuring they kept the entire insurance payout. On Friday, June 18th, Jacqueline took the children to stay with their grandparents for the weekend. On Saturday, she suggested that her husband go out for drinks to relax and talk. Paul gladly accepted the offer, thinking it might help their relationship. He didn't realize it was an invitation to his demise. That night, people in the bar noticed Jackie trying hard to get her non-drinking husband intoxicated. She bought drinks and practically forced him to knock back one shot after another, then let her staggering husband out of the bar after midnight. They were caught on surveillance cameras, and that was the last time Paul was seen alive. This revealed a significant timing discrepancy. The bar was a 10-minute walk from the couple's home, and the attack occurred immediately upon their return, lasting no more than 15 minutes, according to Jacqueline. After that, her husband was supposedly kidnapped and driven away in their car, and she immediately called the police. However, about an hour and a half elapsed between the time they were captured on camera and the call to the police. Investigators believe this time was spent by the perpetrators covering their tracks and staging the scene of an attack by third parties. Moreover, Jacqueline apparently intentionally got her husband drunk, so he couldn't resist. According to her, the criminals kicked Paul while he was down, then began to strangle him by placing a plastic bag over his head and securing it with tape. The nature of the injuries on the deceased's body confirmed her account, but the police were nearly certain by then that the assailants were she and her lover, Ferguson. Incontrovertible evidence. After a long and thorough examination of the crime scene, detectives found a partially erased footprint of a man's shoe, which had been obviously attempted to be cleaned, but poorly. The tread pattern matched Roger's shoes, but this evidence could be considered circumstantial. However, there were other, more substantial pieces of evidence against the criminal couple. In the kitchen trash, a cigarette but with Roger's saliva was found, and on the cable tie that bound Jacqueline's hands was a partial fingerprint of his. Moreover, on the ties binding the deceased's hands and feet, Ferguson's fingerprints were present, and on the bag used to suffocate the victim, sweat and oil traces of both lovers were found. The investigation also uncovered another participant in this brutal crime, a minor acquaintance of Roger named Colin Robinson. Roger called him on the night of the attack, asking for a favor to help with something unspecified. The teenager drove his car, left it at the end of the street at Roger's request, and walked to the house to avoid attracting attention. When Colin realized what was happening, he wanted to run, but Roger intimidated him, and by threatening with a knife, forced him to help move the body to the car and load it into the trunk. Afterward, they drove the car to a deserted place and abandoned it. Initially, the frightened young man denied his involvement in the crime, but he broke down during the second interrogation and began to confess, trial, and sentence. The investigation lasted several months. During this time, they gathered undeniable evidence, interviewed all witnesses, and obtained a confession from the third participant in the crime. However, the trial of the criminals only began in the spring of 2007, almost 3 years after Paul Crimble's deprivation of life. On May 7, 2007, Jacqueline and Roger were found guilty of a premeditated crime with the intent to obtain insurance money. The widow was sentenced to 20 years in prison, while her lover and accomplice received 18 years. The young accomplice, Colin Robinson, was sentenced to 3 years for assisting the criminals and attempting to cover up the truth. Roger's elderly mother also couldn't escape responsibility for perjury and providing a false alibi for her son. However, considering the woman's advanced age and her serious health problems, she was given only a year of probation. Revenge on her own children. Even in prison, Jacqueline continued to ruin her family's lives. She was angry that no one supported her in court and that everyone who knew her personally was relieved when she went behind bars. Even her own mother said that people like Jackie should be isolated from society forever so that they can't harm anyone. Interestingly, a few days after the funeral, Jacqueline burned all of her late husband's belongings and photos, so nothing in the house reminded her of him. Danielle somehow managed to save a couple of photos with her father. She kept them in her bedside table, and her mother simply didn't know about them. The insurance payout of £300,000, for which Paul was assassinated, went to his children. Danielle and Adam lost both parents overnight, but their troubles didn't end there. Their mother was adamantly against either her parents or the murdered husband's parents raising the children. She did everything to deprive them of guardianship rights, so the children ended up in foster care despite having living grandparents. At the time of the tragedy, Danielle was only 11, and her brother Adam was barely 5. Jacqueline managed to retain her parental rights and attempted to manipulate her children from prison. Specifically, she wanted them to publicly declare her innocence using various pressure tactics. For example, she promised to sign permission for their school trips if they visited her in prison, but she deceived them. During the visit, she demanded they testify in her favor and refused to sign the document. As a result, the brother and sister were the only ones who couldn't go on weekend excursions with their class. Now Danielle is 31, living in Basingstoke, working in a daycare, and dating a man named Simon Bryce, who is an engineer. Her brother, now 25, has a good education and moved to London. Jacqueline is set to be released next year, and her adult children are seriously worried that their mother will continue to do everything possible to poison their lives. As the rain falls and the night deepens, thank you for being here with me at Radio Night Crime. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the need to stay aware, even in the stillness of the night. If you enjoyed tonight's story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Let the sound of the rain lull you to sleep, and until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night keep you company.